1970, during a tumultuous time in the United States, a group of artists, musicians, and radicals gathered in Vermont to celebrate a new kind of media, a media made by and for the people, a media that awakens rather than aestheticizes. Goddard College hosted this legendary gathering, and we're doing it again. The country might be even more divided today. As we approach the most important election of our lifetime, mainstream media has been falling short when it comes to informing its audience of the true threats to our democracy. That is why we've gathered this group of game changers for a virtual gathering with the goal of saving our democracy. Welcome to the Goddard College 2022 Alternative Media Conference. In 3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Goddard College Alternative Media Conference. I'm Sabrina Williams from act.tv, and it's my pleasure to introduce our first panel of amazing independent media makers who are meeting the challenges of our times with creativity and innovation. As a note before we get started, I want to encourage everyone to follow along on Twitter with hashtag GoddardAMC. Again, that's hashtag GoddardAMC. In 1970, Goddard College hosted a groundbreaking event featuring some of the most visionary and controversial media creators to emerge during that most tumultuous of eras. Today, we honor the revolutionary legacy of the original conference while adapting to the current reality of our sharply divided country, with the goal of creating media that awakens rather than aesthetizes. Our theme, Democracy at Stake, speaks to the precarity of our current political environment with the understanding that we are no longer limited by conventional wisdom or conventional methods. All of these panelists have distinguished themselves with their mastery of digital content that pushes back against the tepid both-sidedness of the mainstream media. They understand what's at stake as we head into the midterms, and I know we would all like to hear what they have to say in these crucial weeks before the election. With me today are Reed Galen from the Lincoln Project, Charles Lynchner, Organizing 2.0, Ben Meisalis from Midas Touch, and Sarah Tabatabi from Vote Pro Choice. Before we get started, I'd like to ask each panelist to please introduce themselves and their organizations. Reed, let's please get started with you.
Sure, and thanks, Sabrina, for having me, and for everybody at Goddard for including me as well. My name is Reed Galen. I'm one of the co-founders of the Lincoln Project. I grew up in Republican politics, literally. Spent my childhood in it. My dad worked in it, and I worked in Republican campaigns until 2016, when Donald Trump became the nominee of the Republican Party. And I said, if that's what they want, then that's not me. In late 2019, we launched the Lincoln Project. A number of former Republican political consultants and strategists express goal to help defeat Donald Trump in 2020. I hope to believe that we did our part in that, and now we continue with that as we're 27 days away from Election Day, making sure that anti-democracy authoritarian candidates across the country are not elected or re-elected to office as we look forward to 2024 and the current and future challenges that face us. So thanks, Sabrina, for having me.
Thank you, Reed. Charles. Oh, I think you're on mute, Charles.
Hello there. Hi, Sabrina. Nice to see you again. My name is Charles. I'm a co-founder of Organizing 2.0, which does training for the labor movements and community organizing groups around using digital technology for organizing. And I'm still part of a legacy organization called the People for Bernie Sanders, which was one of the most successful social media amplifiers in the 2016 campaign, and continues to play a role.
Excellent. Thank you, Charles. Ben.
Thanks, Sabrina, for having me, and thanks to everybody at Goddard College. It's incredible to be here today. I'm the co-founder of Midas Touch, along with my two younger brothers. Don't really have a political background. Before starting Midas Touch, I was a civil rights litigator who represented families who lost loved ones to police brutality, was involved in organizing, but felt that I wasn't really doing my part. And so in 2020, during the pandemic, when everybody was either furloughed or going through this shared struggle, seeing what was going on, I knew that we had to step into the arena. My brothers and I created this organization called Midas Touch. We didn't know what it was going to end up developing to become, but currently we do about 60 million views on YouTube every month, which equals that of any of the major media networks.
Very nice. Thank you for being here today, Ben. Sarah.
Hi, thanks, Sabrina. I'm Sarah Tabatabai. I am the Chief Political and Communications Officer at Vote Pro-Choice. We are the political home for the pro-choice majority, which means that we create resources to empower folks to use political system to protect reproductive freedom. Whether that's building comprehensive voter guides with recommendations and endorsements all the way down the ballot, or it's recruiting, endorsing, and supporting pro-choice progressive candidates who are running for office across the country. And, you know, we're a group of folks who could have told you what may have surprised so many people recently, which is that the issue of access to reproductive freedom is a winning issue. It is not a polarizing issue. And so now that we are in a world where Roe v. Wade has been overturned, I think we all share a reality that reflects our experience for years, which is that talking to candidates, voters, and folks about reproductive freedom not only wins at the ballot box, but it makes a huge difference in people's day-to-day lives.
Excellent. I am honored to be a moderator for this amazing panel with Reed, Charles, Ben, and Sarah. Let's get started with these hard-hitting questions. With the advent of social media, we've seen a huge rise in the spread of disinformation. On the other hand, social media has been a key tool in fighting that spread, as well as enabling people access to what's happening on the ground of social movements. Some have taken to calling it a necessary evil, but is social media evil at all, or is it merely unregulated? Is social media only evil in the same way any tool could become a weapon in the right hands, or is there more to it than that? Ben, let's start with you.
So I think one of the main problems that we saw in 2016 was that all of the disinformation went completely unrebutted. You had what did Trump's team call it? The Death Star, right? But there was no Jedis. And so in the absence of Jedis, you had this massive flow of disinformation, as well as social media companies not being prepared for the deluge of disinformation on the platforms. One of the things, though, that I think that a lot of the groups that you're seeing here on other panels did very, very good, though, is we had to flood the zone, if you will, with truth and with our own content, and win the war of ideas with respect to the people generally, the same way Trump was spreading disinformation and MAGA was spreading disinformation. So that's really what our whole thesis was, is it's not just one ad, it's not just one video. It is a constant relentlessness. On YouTube, we'll put out 8 to 10 videos a day. On Twitter, we'll put out a constant flood of content every day. We try to get at least one video out a day or new content every single day. Same thing on TikTok, same thing on Facebook. Just swarm it with the truth and the accurate information. Now, there's a broader conversation that we could have about the steps that states are trying to take, specifically the MAGA Republican-led states, to try to stop common sense moderation policies like what we saw Greg Abbott doing in Texas, which was recently affirmed by the Fifth Circuit, which has a lot of problems when you're saying that social media companies can't take disinformation off of their platforms, and the broader question of regulation. But me as a content creator, it's flooding the zone with the truth.
Reed, any additional thoughts there?
Well, I think, some of this is sort of, began at the beginning, right? Which is in 1996, the Telecommunications Act back then basically left all of the fetters off of what they saw as a burgeoning tech, internet growth opportunity, and nobody ever went back and said, wait, especially with the advent of things like the iPhone in 2007, when apps became a thing, social media now became a thing, asking, should any of these platforms be regulated, right? Oh, well, if you regulate them, they won't grow, right? Okay, but now we know that their algorithms lead people to darker places on purpose. There was a study about Instagram that shows that they knew that their algorithm was very harmful to teenage girls, and they did it anyway, right? So is it a necessary evil? Like, I'm not sure that you're going to put the genie back in the bottle, but at the same time, I think Ben's right, which is we also have to understand that there's a whole bunch of social media that isn't for us or anybody watching this panel, right? It exists in a subterranean way, whether or not it's Gab, 4chan, 8chan, any of the stuff where you find QAnon. Like, normal human beings never go to those places because they're awful, but we should not underestimate their impact on things. Where you take, like in Pennsylvania this spring in the US Senate primary there on the Republican side, a woman named Kathy Barnett got 27% of the vote and didn't run a campaign. How did those people find out about her? It was from social media outlets on what I would call the radical right wing, which is a broader messaging and relentless messaging machine that knows exactly where to target its people, how to target its people. It never stops. And I think Ben's right, which is one of our core tenets when it came to Trump or anything, was you have to stay in these people's faces relentlessly, because that's not what they're used to. They're used to rolling over people because people are freaked out, they're scared, or they just stand there with their mouths agape because they can't believe anybody would do this stuff.
Sarah, I know you vote pro-choice and you personally fight the radical right, as Reed just mentioned, on social media every day. What are your thoughts? Necessary evil or tool of change?
I'll just say, social media is bad and evil, but not necessarily for the reasons that we're talking about. Social media creating an attention economy where we're using engagement as a currency means that outrage is the goal. And so, I think one of the best folks doing analysis on this impact of social media is somebody like Bo Burnham. So when we're talking about how our brains work and how we interact with each other, sure, social media is a problem. But like Reed and Ben have said, not sure that the toothpaste is going back in the tube here. And so what that means is we do need to use social media as a tool to not just correct the record, but to make our message and the truth as widespread as possible. And so, to Ben's point, the sort of response to one outrageous ad from our opponents is not another ad. It's to make sure that we are putting out messaging everywhere we can. We are meeting people where they are. It's a sort of across the board approach so that people are encountering these stories in their daily lives. And especially when it comes to reproductive freedom, this is really important, because until recently, there was this idea that talking about abortion access or talking about reproductive freedom was really alienating or really third rail. And so what we're seeing now, we saw it in Kansas, but we also are seeing it in these digital and social spaces, is it's not true. It's very important for people to see the reality that 1 in 3 people of reproductive ability and age will experience abortion care. And so it's important not just to counteract this disinformation that we know exists in this space and across all of the issues we care about, but also to tell our real stories so that people have we can use the tools that it's intended, which is to be social and to connect on a human level.
Charles, Sarah said outrage is the goal. Agree, disagree? And how does Organizing 2.0 effectively craft a message that gets people to positive progressive change?
I want to apologize at the outset and say Organizing 2.0 doesn't do that, or at least doesn't do that very well. But I really liked what Sarah had to say. And I think it goes to the heart of something that is often difficult to talk about when the goal shifts to how do we defeat the bad guys. Because if you're defeating the bad guys, then almost anything that you do that would also defeat the bad guys is a good thing, which is a mirror image of how the bad guys think. And it's instructive to understand that this is in fact a dynamic system in which our own actions impact the other side and vice versa. I think about all the trainings when I was a little bit cyber utopian, and I would talk about the magic of social media. That let's say that you were queer in a small town in America in the 90s, and suddenly the internet came to town, and AOL and chat rooms and Tumblr and all these things. Suddenly people who were isolated in their physical and social family circumstances could connect with other people in all kinds of ways, anonymously, to greater or lesser effect. People could find each other, make common cause. And I think a lot of us were like, this is great. All those groups that weren't represented, that feel that the culture or power is against them, they can finally work together and come up with enough social political power to make the world better for themselves. I, at the time, did not predict that that would be the mirror image of what the right wing is going to do. Find people who feel disaffected, no matter how few they are, how isolated they are, or how, not well their theories are, and organize them together into powerful blocks that can do things together. And that coincides with this wonderful little device that, as Bo Burnham has explained, is addicting people. This is a device to deliver chemicals into my brain. The person who is selling me those chemicals is the entire tech media complex, which gave me the phone and put content on it. And it's conditioning me to crave rewards to my ego, to crave little shots of dopamine in response to holding the phone and touching it. I don't think any of us understands how significant the impact of that is on ourselves. What about older people, less connected to people, folks with different education, different filter bubbles that they survive in? So when I see the left or progressives generally looking at outrage, looking at these emotional triggers to try and counter mobilize against what the right wing is doing, I worry. The medium really is the message. If you invent a printing press, religious wars will not be far behind.
Interesting, very interesting. I like that, Charles. Just turning the corner just a little bit, I want to focus on fascism. Fascism, as we all know, is on the rise around the world, but our response seems to be fairly lackluster. How can we use new media to bolster that response? Reed?
Well, I think you're absolutely right about that. We shouldn't assume that that it's just happening here. We've seen it in Italy. We're seeing it in Sweden. We've seen it in obviously Hungary, Turkey. This is Russia, obviously, for a long time. What I think we have to do first is a little bit of education. We think because we hold this phone up and it holds every bit of information that humanity's ever created that we're somehow smarter. We're not. I think that there's a critical thinking piece of this that goes beyond understanding something because you read it on Wikipedia. Fascism started in Italy, right? Not in Germany. The Germans perfected it, such as it was, and it ultimately led to the destruction of tens of millions of people and ultimately the destruction of their own country. But what it has to do with is unfettered power for a very small group of people. And if you look at it, Dana Lash had this thing about Herschel Walker the other day. She said, I don't care if he aborts baby eagles. I don't care if he paid for abortions for ex-girlfriends. I want control of the Senate. That is fascism. Ron DeSantis going after corporations in Florida because they don't do things he likes is fascism. The idea that we're going to make it harder for people to participate in an election because we don't like what they think or that they might vote against us is fascism. Burning books, all of this. Pro-choice, right? Look, the court in the last few years has done what? Gutted the Voting Rights Act, right? Overturned Roe v. Wade. And I don't think a lot of people get this, and Ben is probably the expert on this. They also overturned the need for Miranda rights. Oh, that's terrific, right? That's a great thing for civil libertarians, but a lot of them are going along with it. Oh, if you don't do anything wrong, right, you don't have anything to worry about. And that is a very dangerous thought process, Sabrina.
Yeah, Ben, thoughts on that?
Reed, to add to that, also removing the separation of church and state and pushing things to more of a theocratic autocracy. Right. One of the things that we do at the Midas Touch Network is frame the issues as there is a pro-democracy movement and there is an anti-democracy fascist movement. We're very careful not to refer to this modern right wing as conservative. And mainstream media still refers to this group as conservative or far right leaning conservatives. And I say it's not a conservative idea to be pro-insurrection. It's not a conservative idea to cheer on and applaud a global pandemic. And I'm not talking about could there potentially be nuanced conversations about should small businesses remain open versus, should they be closed? And we could have intelligent conversations along those lines. But what this radical right-wing MAGA group was, they rooted for the pandemic to kill people and spread disinformation. And saying it with that directness and clarity is something that is, I think, necessary. It's refreshing to our audience. As our audience always says, they say it sarcastically, they go, who knew that there was a market for calling traitors traitors, right? And the mainstream media is so focused on whether they're worried. One, they're carrying the water for billionaires because that's part of the whole conglomerates that they're representing, whether they're also afraid of being sued in defamation law, whatever it is, they are not framing these issues. They're acting like there's legitimate political discourse taking place on both sides.
It's 27 days to election day, less than.
Keep going, Ben.
Oh no, it was just that was my natural end anyway.
Excellent. Charles, I want to ask you, can we fight fascism with new media?
We can fight fascism with every single tool at our disposal. That said, I'm really happy that there are very few armed left-wing groups that call themselves Antifa running around enacting physical sanctions on people they disagree with ideologically. Even though it does happen sometimes, and it could certainly happen a lot more, it'd be terrible because we would lose on that terrain because our enemy is going to be much better at those tactics than we are. So I think about that when it comes to how we use social media. I don't want to point fingers at anyone here, but I think about some of the memes I see, let's say from Occupy Democrats, that are just as hyperbolic and not exactly true and aimed at the gut to get people to respond with outrage and anger and especially the mocking contempt anger, which is perfectly justified in the case of Trump. I think, again, people miss the fact that if the emotional affect that you are spending money and effort to promote as linked to your politics is focused on contempt and mockery and anger and reaction, it becomes a reactionary politics, and the methods that support that are a reactionary set of methods. The reason why we have the rise of extremists isn't a secret. It's the same way that deaths of despair aren't a secret, and why people moving back into their homes during a recession, or children moving back to their parents during recession wasn't a secret. There's underlying crises in our society that are leaving a lot of people fearful, lonely, disconnected, emotionally unregulated. We are failing as a country, as a society, and I mean, there's no exception here. We are failing to sustain healthy people with healthy minds and healthy bodies. Of course, it's going to emerge in the form of extremist politics, every kind of extremism. Like I could name someone who recently left a major party and say, you see, we got them too. It's everyone. And I'm looking for a way, and I haven't found it, to send a message that will mobilize the people that are sick of having their emotions dysregulated by design, for profit, by a political and tech complex that gets paid to do it.
So Sarah, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question to that, and that is, can we fight fascism? Can we fight, threats to reproductive justice with new media, technology, social media, or should we be using those tools to organize people in person, as Charles said, for community, for relationship building? Is that how we fight, when we come together in person as people?
That's a good question. I think it depends on how you use those tools. And so I think just to name, creating a fearful public promotes fascism. And so what we have, our reality is urgent enough. And so I would agree with what has already been said, which is that spreading the truth is the most effective tactic. Being very honest about what we're actually up against is an important tactic, and using new media to educate folks, to send them the information that they need. So not just what are the realities of patients seeking abortion, but also when is your voter registration deadline? When are these pieces of information, where are these pieces of information that you need to make an offline impact? And so those things go together. The overarching umbrella is the goal, whether it's using new media, traditional media, in-person events, whatever the case may be, is to give people an experience which is centered around community. And right now, this is a very diverse coalition of folks who are very concerned about what is happening in our country when it comes to democracy, fundamental and foundational freedoms. And so providing opportunities for connection in person and online is a major step in the direction of keeping that coalition together so that we can fight fascism and protect what is left of democracy.
That's appropriate. You're right. What is left of our democracy? Doesn't seem like there's much left most days. As experts in new media, I'm considering all of you, all of my panelists, experts in new media, what are some nuances people often seem to miss about how we share, use, interpret information that you think we should know? Are we missing something? I think, Charles, you just mentioned, maybe how folks are interpreting certain social media pages, their content in a certain way. Are we just not interpreting them right?
I hope that what I'm about to say is an answer to your question, Sabrina. We shall see. I'm thinking about the ancient rhetorical practice of creating a public, and not to bore everyone, but this is a college event. It just means, you name a group into existence and suddenly they're there. So I could say, left-handed people, we're a group, we've been oppressed for too long, we should rise up and unite. Yeah, me too. And God damn it, we should. But the ability for anyone to create any public on anything is how we have the most insane fights about celebrities' personal lives, about, the race of a cartoon character. All of these things, they're all opportunities for malicious people to create a public around an identity that links to something that will jazz that person up emotionally and dysregulate them. And amazingly, the most effective issues to do that are rarely the ones we wish they would. It's not the economy, it's not unemployment, it's not fighting wars, it's not whether your child will be healthy. It's instead all this other crap that is designed to get us, riled up. And I feel like the consequences of participating in that fight as if we're going to win by doing it as much as the other side, or by inserting our attempts to drown out the other side. I don't think we can win on that battlefield. I also don't think we can leave it, which is why I'm sort of happy to be here with our friends from the Lincoln Project and Mizell and Vote Pro-Choice. We can't leave the battlefield, but we need to recognize and spread awareness that it is a very bad terrain on which we can fight. And we have to leave it and find ways of minimizing it. And everyone who's doing anything in that direction, I think, ought to get more support from the more narrow political tech advertising-based segment of our world. They have an incentive not to push against the whole edifice, not to replace the terrain. Because for those people who earn their living out of, promoting these things, they're actually on the side of the tech giants in dysregulating America for extremism.
So I want to ask Ben a follow-up question about that. often when there's these important videos about often people of color, civil rights being violated, these videos encourage outrage, and it's that outrage that often gets national attention and creates change. But it sounds like Charles feels like sometimes that outrage is manufactured. Outrage is the goal. And I'm wondering if you can speak to, are there segments of society that do actually need to be outraged a little bit more? It's that outrage that will fuel that change.
Well, when a police officer kills an unarmed Black or brown person, I'm outraged, and I don't want the right wing to tell me I shouldn't be outraged about that. And that that is outrage. The manufactured outrage is when Tucker Carlson says that we should be upset that the green M&M's legs look a certain way. That's the manufactured outrage, and we have to be able to disentangle those two. Valid outrage, societal systemic issues, taking away childbearing persons' right to choose, make decisions over that. That's outrageous. I'm pissed. I want to share that. I want to share that outrage through a filter that connects with people, and then disentangling that from all the fake and bogus outrage out there. And to Charles' overall kind of point is, I think that you almost look at this social media, new media landscape as a chessboard, and different people have different roles in what they're going to be doing. And sometimes, do you have someone who's just expressing maybe outrage on social media? Do I think that's the most productive way of dealing with complex issues? I don't, but do I think that almost like there's a blocker in the NFL who you need the blocker so that the quarterback can throw the pass and ultimately, get in the end zone? I do think you need those different roles to take place. One of the things that we try to ultimately do at Midas Touch is then filter everybody to our marquee content, which is actually fairly, I've always thought it was boring stuff, but to me, it's where the stuff gets done. It's me sitting here go to our YouTube. The videos that thrive are like the 30-minute to 45-minute videos of me breaking down Judge Eileen Cannon's order and Clarence Thomas asserting that he's ordering the Department of Justice to respond, and what the 11th Circuit's per curiam decision means and what per curiam is. So there's a thirst and appetite actually for the knowledge. But how do we also kind of filter people to get to those spaces where real good quality information, well-researched information is being provided? That has to be the goal in social media spaces, and then also in the real world spaces with, as Sarah said, as Charles said, as Reed said, with the ultimate goal of community. Because I do think one of this, going back to the overall point of your question with this manufactured outrage, it still binds these communities of hate. And people are going to these MAGA rallies sometimes because they don't have anyone else to talk to. And it's a community where the Uncle Sam guy who sings the Mar-a-Lago national anthem is there. Hey, what's up, buddy? Da, 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 da. But they're promoting fascism. But it's a community. And so we have to show people there is this community of love, of democracy, of fighting for each other's rights, of uplifting. And that's hopefully what we share at Midas Touch. That's what, the groups here share. It's that love, it's that outreach, it's supporting each other.
Reed, I want to follow up on something that Ben said. If political and social change is a chessboard or a football field or what other analogy fits for your world, I want to ask, number one, what is the goal? Is it the ballot box? Is it electing, progressive leaders? And so my question is, what is the goal and what are the tools specifically that you and Lincoln Project think is the strategy to get to that goal?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that, Charles's broader point is correct. I think that the trouble for us is, you take like someone like Trump, right? Who, we like to say we live rent free in his head. Like we started, Rick Wilson, another co-founder of mine, and I started talking about this in 2018. We'd go to these like really fancy homes in Calorama in Washington, D.C. with these very earnest Republicans. And they're like, oh, yeah, we're going to make Trump look like a loser and we're going to show why his policies are bad and blah, 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 blah. I'm like, no, you're going to have to get in this guy's face and you're going to have to stay there. And our job in 20, and if he runs again in 24, is, we distracted him, right? We totally disrupted, his and subsequently his campaign's ability to function, which they wouldn't have had candidly anyway. But, we made sure that, like, while Joe Biden was the newly presumptive nominee, he had the 3 or 4 months he needed to get his operation together so that they could move into the general election in a place where, the Trump people weren't able to tee off on him all day, every day. And so we see the disruptive nature of this, I think, is very important. Now, I think to both Charles and Ben's point, not all outrage is created equal. If you see a cop state kneel on a man's neck, for 9.5 minutes and he dies, right? That's something worthy of outrage. When you see a young man cross a state border, with an AR-15, and he's now created, as a hero, right, amongst, the ultra MAGA, as I'll call them, right? That's worthy of outrage because he is a young man who knows better. He was exonerated for his acts. And so now do I think that, what do we have to do now? I think that, it's sort of like being on an airplane in the midst of really bad turbulence, right? You can do one of two things. You can say, let's turn the engines off and hope it stops, right? Or you can put your head down and fly through it. And that's where we are right now. We are in a turbulent period. Where do we go next? I think we'll know that after we help Democratic candidates, big D Democratic candidates, win in 2022 and subsequently in 2024. Look, I'm not a Democrat. We're a Democratic organization, but we only have one pro-democracy party left in the country, right? So from our perspective, it's twofold. One is helping elect those Democrats, many of whom, look, I probably disagree with y'all on, actually, let's be clear, like 20% of things, right? It's probably more method than outcome, right? But the truth is like, we also know how to speak to a very particular set of, Republican, self-identified Republican voters who are probably, very upset with what their party's become, like we have. So yeah, part of it is political, but I think a lot of it too is fighting in the culture, which is one thing I think we really haven't gotten into, which is these are culture wars. Republicans have been really good for the last 40 or 50 years at fighting culture wars and saying to Democrats, hey, come in the alley, I want to show you something, right? And then beating you over the head with the culture war because it was the same thing over and over and over again. I think Democrats are getting better at that, not taking the bait. Once in a while, you got to punch somebody in the nose, right? Dobbs is a great example of this. Like, oh, you wanted to make it about abortion. I think Ben's point about this is right too. Like, there's a hell of a lot more nuance in the abortion issue than whether or not it's pro-choice or pro-life, right? There's a hell of a lot more. And now now Republicans are scrambling all over the place to scrub their websites of, no exceptions, no nothing, right? Because they know it's not only it's bad politics, but I'll say this too, is that you see that when Mitch McConnell makes the Faustian bargain with Donald Trump to create a conservative judiciary, like, this is what they wanted. Why did they do this? Because they know that their policies and their ideas are broadly unpopular with the American people, so they have to codify them in a way that makes it very difficult to undo them, right? The 5 members of the court who overturned Roe knew exactly what they were going to do. They knew that it would tear the country down the middle, and they were happy to do it, and they did it with a smile on their face. You can't turn away from that. So yes, it's electoral, it's cultural, but it's also foundational, right? Like, we've said this, an ad hoc coalition of pro-democracy people came together in 2020 to get Joe Biden elected. It will take that same kind of coalition this year to do it, and it'll be a different coalition in 2024. They form and reform, and every year. And like, we'll work with anybody who's willing to fight that fight. And listen, I want to get back to arguing about marginal tax rates and parts per billion of carbon in the atmosphere. I really do, because those things are really important and they really matter about who we are as a country. But in this fight, it's about democracy and democracy alone. And it's at the ballot box. It's on the airwaves. It's on the internet. It's on social media. And it's on forums like this for folks to know not to get discouraged. Because if there's one thing, Sabrina, and then I promise I'll shut up, that I see too much, and I say this to all of my Democratic friends with all the love in the world, is like, you won't win if you don't fight. Okay? Like, a year ago, the world is lost, right? 6 months ago, the world is lost. Like, it's not. Like, if you don't believe you can win, you won't, right? And I hate to make it like so cut and dry, but as the only probably former Republican on the thing here, like as a young Republican operative, you're taught one thing: win. That's it. Win. You know why? Because voters won't remember, right? And as Mitch McConnell, famously said, winners make policy and losers go home. And I understand that Democrats are much better people, generally speaking, right, than Republicans are when it comes to campaigning. But if you want to have moral victories that you feel good about, but you lose the country, have you won or have you lost?
Reed, wow, that was so many amazing gold nuggets of information that, of course, I've got to follow up with Sarah to respond to. Sarah, Reed says we have to win. You know we have to win. I know we have to win. Everyone on this panel knows we have to win. But how do we win, not just at the ballot box, but also the culture war when we're fighting fascism, but also, right, very important topics like reproductive justice and access?
Yes, there's a lot that was just said. Yeah, of course we have to win. I will say that, yeah, we can talk about this as a culture issue or a culture war issue. But this is an economic issue. I mean, being forced to have children against your will is an economic tragedy. And in addition to the fact that it violates racial justice, gender justice, LGBTQ justice, and so many other issues that we care about. And so I think that's the thing, is these identity politics issues, it's not identity politics when it's your life. And so that's why, whether we're using tools like social media, traditional media, whatever the case may be, it's really important for us to connect human to human. I'm 7 months pregnant currently by choice. It doesn't feel like an identity issue to believe that a politician doesn't get to tell me what happens during my pregnancy. And so that feels just as relevant to me as whether or not I can afford to fill up my gas tank, as whether or not I feel as though I have job security. And so we need to, the same way that I think Reed is exactly right, there are many different roles to play in this coalition. We also need to talk about these issues in the way that they really manifest in real life, across the board, because I've seen this done really effectively this year by a lot of politicians. Some folks talk about overturning Roe v. Wade as an issue that could drive jobs out of their state. Some folks like Stacey Abrams talk about overturning Roe v. Wade as an issue that will criminalize patients, doctors, and women. Those are both true. And so being able to express what is at stake for different folks in different circumstances is an important part of this conversation, because it's much easier. Like, there is one party that is predominantly one gender, one race. We are a super diverse coalition of folks who lead very different lives. And so telling all of those stories helps bring people in together, to, Ben and Reed's point, to make sure that we are all connected in a fight for democracy against fascism, for whatever reason we individually, came to the table for.
We only have a few minutes left. I want to ask one last question of each panelist, and that is, for all of the digital organizers out there, what is the number one most important thing that you think that they can do to organize support, galvanize, support and interest to make positive, progressive change in this country using social media? Ben, let's start with you.
Yeah, it starts with one view, and then it goes to 10 views, or it starts with one follower and it grows to 10 followers, and then 10,000. And then you just can't be discouraged in this process. I mean, we started we weren't political, we weren't involved in organizing. We just knew, like, we had to fight for our country, or else our communities, our country was going to be destroyed. And we fought every single day for it. And it was just a relentless amount of work. I mean, it's work throughout the whole day. I mean, it's nonstop work. It's the most rewarding work imaginable. But it's a relentless amount of work, and studying different digital platforms. What you do on YouTube is different than what you do on Twitter, different than what you do on TikTok. And and you have to study it. And I studied all different creators. Like, I wanted to know, how is Mr. Beast on YouTube getting 100 million views? And I researched, I watched his videos. I saw how he did it. And sometimes how I title it, how I do a thumbnail. But the whole goal of all of this at the end is to bring people to that ultimate content, to that event, to that whatever it is. They have to be shifted to a place where then there's action. The action is to vote. The action is to phone bank. The action is to register voters. It all goes there, but you got to just do the work. You got to roll up your sleeves, and it just takes a ton of time. There's no other way around that. There's no shortcut in the digital space, but it's the most rewarding thing when you figure it out.
I love that, Ben. But as you all know, ACT TV's motto is do more than act. So I love that, Ben. Charles, single most important thing we can do to organize and make change using social media.
I look back at the glory days of Occupy Wall Street, when an event that started off very inauspiciously ended up being replicated in hundreds of places in the United States and then other parts of the world. And of course, we were just following on the heels of the Arab Spring. It was beautiful to see that. And it was a great example of how, regular people, okay, not regular people at first, but, optimally regular people could do so much, get so much attention and change the narrative. I don't think those kinds of things ought to be emphasized anymore. As Zainab Tufekci was writing in Twitter and Tear Gas, there was a possibility of being able to organize lots of people quickly, like a diet version of what really building a people's movement looks like. And there isn't a shortcut. Social media isn't going to save us. And social media, much like politics, has a tendency to grant success to the people who are most likely to be narcissists in need of therapy. And on those grounds, you need to be very cautious about getting addicted to that entire world, while at the same time using the critical lens of what you consume, both from your own people and from the right.
Reed, how can we use social media, not become narcissists, and make change?
No, I think Charles makes a good point. It is, he made the point earlier about the whole sort of dopamine rush thing. It is very, you can get sucked into it, right? You post something. I mean, Ben, we do this too. Like, how many, we put something out, how many views did it get? There's some benchmark. I don't even know if we keep track of it, but if it like hits the benchmark, we're happy. And if it's not, like, okay, well, we didn't really do, we missed on something, right? And we don't test any of our ads. We don't do any of that stuff. We try and figure out, like, what do we think is going to be most effective to a given audience, whether or not that's old Republicans, progressive Democrats, whatever. But I think that, to me, it goes back to what a lot of people have said, which is social media, just like any online thing, is only as good as it is when it connects an actual human being to an analog act, right? Jumping the air gap from the digital to the analog, right? A phone call to somebody, text, okay, that's sort of middle ground, knocking on somebody's door, right? Getting together for a text bank. And I think the community piece of this is really, is worth a whole year's worth of discussion all by itself, because we're all just terribly lonely, right? That's what so much of this is at its base. So finding that person, right? And I've interviewed people about QAnon and Proud Boys and all, like, you have to almost treat folks like, you have to say, I'm going to be there for you. I don't agree with you on anything, right? You're going to wake up from this fever dream one day, and when you are, I'm going to be here, right? If you start screaming at somebody about their beliefs, you think they're going to listen to you? They're not. I get it, right? But I think the other part too is, we try is sometimes as clownish as, we see, MAGA supporters can appear, and they sometimes actually dress up as clowns. If you belittle them just for who they are, for their, they didn't go to college, they didn't do this, they don't look like me, they don't act like me, they don't like my TV shows, right? Then you are, as Charles said, I think becoming as much a part of the problem as you are part of the solution. So I think it's understanding. I think it's community. I think it's, again, getting folks to take literal physical action, right? Whether or not it could be voting, right? Just vote. Fine, I'll take it. But I think ultimately, long term, it's going to have to be a pretty clear-eyed view of our country. Why are so many of these races as close as they are when 299 election deniers are on the ballot, right? We know it's fiction, but that many people believe it. Herschel Walker should be down 15. He's not, right? Carrie Lake is insane. She might win. What are we missing, right? And that's going to be some self-reflection too, that for a lot of people is not going to be easy.
Sarah, final words of the panel.
Okay, I'll say first, just tactically, like, naming the experience of voting is very different for folks. So straight up, for those of us who are on this panel or folks who are listening to this panel, we have to remind ourselves that the majority of people have not started to think about the midterm election yet. And so what that means is it's really important to use new media and all tools to just, one, remind folks that there is an election happening, what is at stake, and literally just the logistics of how to take action. So that online engagement turning into offline action of, here's your polling place, these are the hours, do you need to bring something in the state that you are in? Because I would guess for most of us on this panel, the voting experience is easier than it is for many other people. So that's just one, is just flooding the airwaves with the information that is necessary to take action. And then also, I think Reed brought this up earlier, is making it really clear, like, we can win. It's really hard because there are a lot of systems in place that don't require the majority of people in order to win. But reminding folks, yes, this is dire, urgent, tiring, all of that is by design. But it's also really important to show there's a lot of possibility. And I think new media is a tool for that too, to show momentum, victories. And I would say moving into, the final stages of this election is uplifting urgency and the things that truly are outrageous and cause outrage, in addition to those stories of success, the stories of possibility, and how close we really, so many of these elections, many of whom have election deniers on the ballot, they're decided by a couple hundred votes at the local level. And so reminding folks that, tweeting is not the thing, but voting or whatever, participating in some civil activity can make a huge difference. And we can all do it together if we decide that it's worth fighting for democracy.
And I'm going to speak on behalf of our audience, I'm sure that's tuned in, and everyone. Fighting for our democracy is important, and I know that we're all going to do it. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, to Reed, Charles, Ben, and Sarah, for being on the Fighting Fascism with New Media panel today. I appreciate your time. Next up, we're going to play an interview between Goddard College President Dan Hakoy and author and music industry veteran Danny Goldberg, who attended the original conference back in 1970. Here's that interview.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dan Hakoy, president of Goddard College, and it is my great pleasure to join you today for the 2022 Alternative Media Conference. The first Alternative Media Conference took place 52 years ago in 1970, and it's been a proud tradition of the college ever since. I truly believe that Goddard's mission to sustain, promote, and advance democracy in the country, which was critical in 1970 and at our inception in 1938 is as important today as ever before. Democracy has, as you all know, has been experiencing some challenges recently, not the least of which is the January 6th attempt to overturn the 2020 election. So all the more fitting that I am here today with Danny Goldberg, who was present at our first alternative media conference in 1970, and who is an author of a very timely book, as we are in the throes of the January 6th hearings of the U.S. House Select Committee. His book's entitled Bloody Crossroads 2020, Art, Entertainment, and Resistance to Trump. So Danny was a columnist for Billboard in 1970, and he's written about his participation at that seminal alternative media conference, which occurred during a similarly divisive time in our history. So his presence today allows us to connect to the first alternative media conference, as well as provide us with the historical context for the moment we're experiencing now. Danny is president of Gold Village Entertainment and has worked in the music biz as manager, record company president, PR man, and he's also been a prolific journalist and author since the late 60s. He is a champion of progressive causes, and I am absolutely delighted to have him here 52 years later. So, Danny, what a pleasure it is to meet you, and thanks so much for joining us today. It's been a minute, or 52 years. So to get started, can you tell us what led you to our first alternative media conference?
I was working as a journalist, kind of a so-called rock writer. I think by that time I was freelance for Crawdaddy magazine. Had been at Billboard, Record World, and some other places. And a friend of mine named Danny Fields, who was what today we would call an influencer, very, very towering figure in the counterculture music business nexus at that time, told me about it and got me invited. So I was excited to go, and it was an easy decision to go once I got the invite.
Cool. Yeah. What was your experience of it when you were there?
It was really inspiring in many ways. First of all, it was the first gathering, possibly the only one during that era, of a couple of hundred people who were working in what was then a very new kind of radio. It was actually called underground radio. That was the industry term for the format.
Oh, wow.
And it was those stations on the FM band that were playing albums, not just the hit singles, the so-called top 40. And at that brief moment, the people that were programming those stations were more identified with the hippie culture and than they were with the broadcasting business.
Right.
By 1972 or 1973, the corporate owners of stations had systematized the programming, and the word underground was gone, and it became album-oriented radio. So it was a very brief period when there were dozens and dozens of radio stations in North America, mostly the US, but also Canada, that were not only programming disparate music, whether it was John Coltrane or Country Joe and the Fish, or of course the big superstars like Hendrix, the Beatles, and the Stones. And most of them a lot of them were getting high when they were on the air.
Sure.
A lot of them were talk about the anti-war movement when they were on the air, things that were not okay a couple of years later. But at that moment, there was this sense that there was this, change happening, that in the media, and that the media, the so-called alternative media, which originally referred to those radio stations, but also included the so-called underground newspapers. There were dozens and dozens of these weeklies in almost every major city: New York, LA, Atlanta, San Francisco, many other places that were similarly covering the so-called counterculture. And so most of us, I'd say 90% of the people there or more, we were meeting each other for the first time. We knew these names from reading about them, but it was this sense of community. It was described by some people as kind of an elite Woodstock.
Oh yeah, right. Oh my God.
Common purpose of people who hadn't met each other before. And it included people from the sort of what would later be called the New Age spiritual movement. Ram Dass was there. Great thought leader, first as part of the introduction of LSD to the Western world with Timothy Leary, and then he got fired from Harvard, went to India, met his guru Nim Karoli Baba, and by this time had written the book Be Here Now, which has sold millions and millions of records. And it was new. And it also, because the record companies cared so much about relationships with the so-called underground radio stations, who were a marketing vehicle, it included a lot of bands. A lot of bands were flown in. The Grateful Dead came in on I think there was a chartered airplane along with members of the Hog Farm. I believe they were all on acid when they arrived. The Jay Giles Band, which was a new band, played. And I forget some of the other ones. And there were, so it was a mixture of radio broadcasters, journalists, musicians.
It's awesome.
Counterculture, pundits. Paul Krasner, the editor of The Realist, was an important figure at the time. And Bob Fass had a radio show on WBAI in New York from midnight to 4, where, during the Chicago 8 trial, Abby Hoffman would call in every night. And
oh my goodness.
And Harvey Kurtzman, who had been one of the original editors of Mad Magazine, which was an influence on people coming into the 60s, was there. So it was a pretty cool gathering from my point of view as someone who was still 19. I didn't turn 20 until July.
Wow.
And, it was also an important time politically in the left, because the gay rights movement, for example, had just sort of been born a year earlier at Stonewall. So feminism had just entered the dialogue of the left. So those voices were very present also, and to many of us were relatively new voices. So it was an interesting combination of energies.
The extreme political polarization we're experiencing in the country, in which you just referenced, there's so little common ground, and in which violence and unethical behavior is being condoned as legitimate political expression. So how do you think artists could promote mutual understanding or contribute to the healing of some of the deep divides that we find in our country today?
Well, I think there's two sides to that question. One of what artists can do, and the other of what people who are in this political sphere, whether they're pundits or thinkers or academics, or whether they're elected officials or people involved with, activist groups like the ACLU and Planned Parenthood and so forth, what they can do to tune in more with the language of arts. Because I think artists are going to do what they're going to do. I think historically, not just in the United States, but globally, artists tend to veer toward the left, whatever you would call it. They tend to be more egalitarian. Not all of them. There were pro-Trump actors and singers, and there were pro-Vietnam actors and pro-Vietnam War actors and singers. And I'm sure there were pro-slavery actors and singers. But the majority, and I mean 70, 80% of the people who have audiences as singers, actors, screenwriters, painters, whatever, tend to veer toward the left. And I think that they should be encouraged to participate and to weigh in a way that feels comfortable to them. There are some people like John Legend who really are intricately involved with the mechanics of politics while also being artists. There are others that like to stick to sort of moral frames and not get involved with day-to-day politics. And art is important in its own right. I think it's what democracy and freedom gives us. Our art has to kind of come first for artists, but to the extent that they can participate, I think it's great. I think 2020, I think Trump's election in 2016 was a gigantic wake-up call for a lot of the creative community. The level of engagement in 2020 dwarfed any previous level of engagement by entertainers and artists in the electoral world.
So you were talking about social media. I mean, how do you see the role of artists in this kind of continually changing digital canvas? So many new outlets, and then it's almost I too am a free speech guy. It's almost become an anarchy of speech, right? Like where even the most inconsequential person could start a meme that has outsized influence on people's opinions. And I mean, it could be, and that's the wonderful thing too, right? I mean, but what's the future look like in terms of that changing canvas for artists? And
Well, I mean, obviously, I don't actually know, but I could guess. As long as
you have history.
my guess is as good as somebody else's. I mean, I think first of all, again, the human mind has to catch up with technology. And I think as a community, and different ages catch up quicker, younger people catch up a lot quicker than people my age, of contextualizing what's coming at them. And they call it media literacy, and being able to, for example, you get 5 people on Twitter or Facebook attacking you, and you can feel, oh my God, I'm being attacked by so many people, or even 1,000 people, which is overwhelming experience to be on the receiving end of 1,000 people.
Right.
Country of several hundred million people, that's not a lot of people. And you can't judge the whole world by 1,000 people. And I think we all have to learn to have a sense of proportion about some of the attacks. Now, there are things that are in a totally different category, like the people that put people's, home addresses on the internet, and or people that try to destabilize or disable people's computers. That's a totally different kind of behavior. But just the idea of getting a few criticisms. I know with artists, they'll say, oh my God, I'm getting complaints from fans. And I'll say, well, how many? If you have 500,000 hardcore fans and 20 people complaining, that means 499,000 people didn't complain.
Sure.
Maybe we should do some other kind of research to find out how fans feel, especially in an era when people can fabricate email addresses, and sometimes 20 emails really come from one person.
Right,
So
exactly.
Media literacy and a sense of proportion is going to naturally happen as the years pass by, and mitigate a little bit of the freakouts that we've seen from memes, that have, I think, unintended and or inappropriate, consequences. Then I think artists adjust to new technology. When I started, when I was a kid, there was no such thing as stereo. And stereo came along. I remember my parents had friends who got the first stereo in our neighborhood. So we all went over their house to listen to the stereo. And the original stereo records were like sound effects records, like ping pong, where you'd hear like a ping pong ball over here, ping pong ball. Oh, stereo, far out. But it wasn't, then the early records were very clumsy. You'd have the drums on one channel. Years later, the Beatles figure out how to make Sgt. Pepper's and use stereo as part of art.
Right.
And I think that each new technology starts as a gimmick. I think the metaverse, for example, right now is mostly a gaming platform. And the that I've seen on the Oculus, again, I'm old, so I'm sure I'm missing things, but my experiment with it was very lame kind of attempts of integrating a concert experience or things like that to me were not going to be inspiring or meaningful. But some artist is going to figure out how to use virtual reality as an art form, the way the Beatles did with stereo. And it's going to change art in movies and TV and other kinds of communications. It hasn't happened yet, but I think it's inevitable every time there's a new tool for artists. But the existence of a tool is one thing. Artists figuring out how to turn it into art takes years.
Right.
I remember I used to, during the Occupy Wall Street period, I was managing a guy named Tom Morello, who was in Rage Against the Machine and who kept going to Occupy. He was a very big radical. And people from the movement would say, how come Tom hasn't written a song to be the anthem of the movement? And I say, just because a song is 3 minutes long, it takes more than 3 minutes to write it, right? I mean, that's why there's 2 years between albums. Otherwise, it's an album every day, So the creative process takes time. And has to catch up. So I think the artists will be fine, but we got to give them time to be artists.
Got it. Yeah. So speaking of artists, so Goddard has some wonderful programs in socially engaged art, creative writing, interdisciplinary arts. And for you, having worked in the business as much as you have, what advice would you give artists or journalists just coming out of college, or those fearful of pursuing such programs because of anxiety about making a living afterwards?
Well, there's an old expression, I think it's a Muslim expression, trust in God, but tie up the camels. So I would say, trust in your own inner voice as an artist, and don't be discouraged by people that don't get it, because we know all the stories of great works of art that were not initially understood. Back, if you want to talk about the 60s, or early 70s, the original conference, Jimi Hendrix's first album did not get a good review, did not get a rave review in Rolling Stone. It was considered that the great guitar player, but what about the songwriting? Now, some years later, we look at manic depression. Are you experienced? Pretty good songwriting. About 50, 60 years. So I think the number one is don't be discouraged. Number two is do arithmetic and understand you have to pay your rent. Or else you can't be a good artist, and you have to do what you have to do. In some areas, people have so-called day jobs. Some areas they can find day jobs, musicians play weddings or something so they can go home and do art. So I would say don't be discouraged, persevere, because rejection comes with art, but also do the math to make sure that you take care of yourself and people around you, or else you're going to have a tragic situation.
Right, and tie up the camels, right?
Platitudes, but that's kind of all I could come up with off of that.
No, and tie up the camels. I mean, that's good advice. I mean, so just a couple more questions. Saying, what do you hope happens at this year's Alternative Media Conference?
Oh, I just hope people get inspired to do good in the world. Everybody processes that differently, but it's an opportunity to think longer term. And to think, quote unquote, I hate that cliche, out of the box, but I can't think of a better one. I just hope they get inspired to engage in a positive way with the world. This crazy world that we live in.
Well, I think this interview has been inspiring, certainly for me. Well, Danny, our time has just flown by. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so very much in taking the time to be with us today. We hope to see you again soon. Hopefully a little sooner than 52 years, but
I'd love to get up there and visit. I love Vermont, and I love the politicians, the Vermont elects.
That's right.
Anyway, God bless. Good luck to everybody at the conference, and let's keep doing our best.
Thanks so much, Danny. Take good care, my friend.
Thanks.
All right. Bye for now.
Bye.
Welcome back to the Goddard College Alternative Media Conference. My name is Jocelyn McCurdy-Keats with ACT.tv, and I'm bittersweet thrilled to be hosting this wonderful pressing conversation about messaging for the climate emergency. This is a topic that is especially pressing for people my age who are facing a literal existential threat to our survival, and watching the media and politicians around us not give this even a little bit of the urgency it deserves. Fortunately, I am surrounded by people who are doing that work. I'm so excited to be here with friends and colleagues. Would you all like to introduce yourselves, starting with Jay?
Hi, I'm Jay Ponte. I'm an activist and an author of Be the Revolution. Most of my time is spent focused trying to help humanity wake up to the urgent calls for the climate emergency.
Nico? Mute, sorry.
Yes, hi, apologies. My name is Nico Georgiadis. I'm co-founder of Unicorn Riot and journalist. This is important. Thank you so much for the invitation and for including all of us on this panel. Very important discussion. As you mentioned in the intro, we're living amongst wild times, and hopefully some of this messaging and some of this ideas can be brought to the broader community.
Alice?
Hey everyone, my name is Alice Hu. I am a climate activist based in New York City. I have a specialty in thinking through how direct action and theatrical protest and just protest movements in general can be a really powerful force for not only spreading the message of the climate emergency further, but also as an important part in terms of political campaigning and putting pressure on power brokers and politicians and corporate CEOs and so on to make the sort of structural and systemic changes that are needed to address the climate crisis. Really excited for this conversation. Thanks.
Awesome. And last but not least, Matt.
Hey, excited to be here. My name's Matt Haugen. I am a research fellow with the Climate and Community Project. I write a newsletter about climate and ecological crisis called Terrain, and I organize in my spare time with around Green New Deal stuff with DSA.
Yeah, I'm so starstruck by all of you. Thank you for being here. And, a lot of this conversation is preaching to and with the choir. But, I imagine all four of you feel a little bit like Cassandra. There is just a real lack of urgency around this, right? We all know, I feel like every year there's another terrifying series of scientific reports that we have like 5 minutes to save humanity. And it's easy to blame policymakers, but there isn't really the urgency from the public that there needs to be either. So as activists, storytellers, communicators, how do you all see us moving forward and trying to breed that urgency in the coming years? Jay?
Well, I guess the approach that that I take, the Buddha once told a parable about how the house was on fire, but the children are too enthralled with their toys. So you have to come up with a better way to convince them to get outside, like to convince them there's better toys. He called it upaya. And so for me, I find that doing direct actions that are possibly viral, kind of engage people's already conditioned response to entertainment. We've been so conditioned by our culture to be consumers and to consume entertainment. That's so much a part of our identity. I think you have to hack into that as much as possible. So whenever I'm organizing a direct action, I'm sort of from the Abby Hoffman Yes Men school of sort of doing direct actions that are theatrical. So if we're going to disrupt a bank or something like that to help people understand that their money is funding fossil fuel projects, for instance, I try to incorporate that theatrical viral nature into the direct actions. Beyond that, though, I think it's also important to have these conversations now to help people understand that capitalism and atomization, under capitalism, we have become atomized, which means we have been broken down into individuals. Our identities are as individuals, which has psychically removed us from feeling that we are part of something greater. It destroys solidarity. It turns us into passive consumers. Like our job is just to sit behind our screens and buy stuff, basically. So I think having some of these discussions and encouraging people, like Danny Goldberg was just talking about Occupy got people out of the house and brought them together. So anytime we can do that, encourage people to get out and come together, I think that's a step in the right direction.
Well, Jay, I think we talked about that the last time I saw you in LA, about how a lot of the successes of the early labor movement in America were because people viewed themselves as part of a community and part of a wall of, workers, like racial justice, gender justice. This individual thing, it's kind of like a contradiction in terms. We can't individually activist our way out of these very universal collective problems. Alice, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, for sure. I think I definitely agree with Jay. The more theatrical and interesting and potentially viral a direct action is, the better. I also think that it's incredibly important for direct actions to tie in not just the messaging around the climate emergency, but about other critical emergencies that we're facing, the crisis of neoliberalism, of austerity, of inequality, right? I think a lot about this because I work as a climate campaigner at New York Communities for Change. We're a grassroots organization of low-income people of color in New York City and Long Island, and probably our most well-known fight in the past decade was starting Fight for 15 in New York City with SEIU. So, like, we know what it means for the vast majority of the public day by day to be thinking about these bread and butter issues, to be thinking about inequality, to be thinking about rents and rising housing costs and so on and so forth. And so to that end, I think any kind of theatrical climate related event also needs to tie in other important crises. For me, I'm really interested in the issue of economic inequality and neoliberalism and so on. So that's what I like to focus on. Like, for example, this summer, I helped lead a series of protests out in the Hamptons, of course, famous for being the site of where people who use summer as a verb go to do that summering during the summers. And we called it Occupy the Hamptons, obviously a nod to the original Occupy. We did some, direct actions at street intersections, but also at the East Hampton Airport, which is primarily used for incredibly rich vacationers to fly between their New York City offices to the Hamptons because, they can't be in traffic like the rest of us. And those actions went super viral. We got feature pieces in the New York Times, in the Independent, in Vanity Fair. Like, we got hits in, the largest publications, some of the largest publications across the country and, even in the UK. And so thinking about why did that hit a chord? I think it hit a chord because it was thinking about private aviation as both a massive generator of carbon emissions, but also, just what it represents in terms of the stark inequality that we have in this country and, around the world. So I think that is definitely something that I'm thinking about too, like, because we know that there is, there's a lot of breakthrough. Like, the corporate media doesn't like talking about climate change. There's been decades worth of work being done around climate denial, very high level conservative operatives funding both bankrolling politicians, but also bankrolling sort of think tanks, universities, so on and so forth. And so there's just a lot of, forces against you. So if you want your thing to break through, not only should you rely on social media and just ordinary people being super into this kind of stuff, but you also want to think, what is an angle that really hits at some of the zeitgeist issues that people are really thinking about. And I think inequality is among one of the biggest things that's on people's minds, especially with the inflation and cost of living crises nowadays.
Yeah, these issues really aren't siloed, right? And I think, no one on this call, of course, but there have been, a history of climate organizers being in their own little space instead of, you're right, this is a consequence of neoliberalism and extreme authoritarian systems of thought and power. This is a consequence. And even if we got rid of the climate crisis tomorrow, if we don't dismantle these systems, we're going to have just as many other mortal perils to ordinary people like us. Nico, I see you nodding. What are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah. I think that what was brought up was really good by Jay and Alice and you as well. I think you sort of have to go back to the root of it, right? And so, like, what is the root cause of what we're dealing with? It seems like capitalism, seems like greed, and it seems like within that mix, that creates a lot of the inequality you're talking about, right? And so, like, when I look at some of these actions that have gone sort of more viral or like that have more what I felt drawn like the more mainstream or like maybe not people that aren't really into it, were like a banner drop in Minneapolis at a Vikings game where people scaled the like top of the whole US bank. And then from there, they dropped the, defund DAPL, huge banner, 40-foot banner. And I think that like walking around the Viking stadium and watching people's reaction to that was really interesting to me because obviously, like, we're all like, yeah, like we would want to make sure that the banks or make sure that the people know about the banks that are funding, like Jay brought up, fossil fuel extraction projects, right? And then maybe try to push them to not fund them or try to push people to get their money out of the banks, right? But watching people's reaction to that while I was walking around the Viking Stadium while that happened 4 years ago was really interesting, because I saw some people be like, why just really mad and rude that like, oh, they actually went up to this. Why are they doing this at the Vikings game? Why are they, putting their lives in danger? And then other people were like, well, what is DAPL? And then from there, I heard discussions like, well, why would they want to defund it? And then they start looking it up. And so that to me was like really powerful, to where if you especially have that back end where if they start looking it up, you have the search engine linked up to, where you want them to search, then I think it was really, really powerful on that level. But I just wanted to bring that instance up because I thought that it was really important to see 70,000 people or 50,000 people, however many people sit in the US Bank Stadium during the Vikings game, watch and react to that. They had to clear out a whole row because of the threat that, the climbers might fall on the row. So it was a huge deal inside the stadium. They didn't bring it up on, the big overhead camera or anything. They didn't talk about it. I don't even think they talked about it in the broadcast of the game, but inside the stadium, watching the people's reaction. So anyways, that's one tiny little bit of action that I thought was like very interesting on the level of theatrical, right? But also a level of like sort of oomph, the impulse. So anyways, beyond that, I think that when it comes to messaging, right, for activists looking at it from the media side of things and what comes out, I think really what was really important during the DAPL movement was the defund DAPL push. And I think that helped a lot of people that were really veering away from caring about the direct actions that were happening consistently. I think it helped them put back into a mode of action that they could partake in. And so I think that like it's really important to look at how we frame these issues, and then how we frame the call to action sometimes, where sometimes it might be a call to action that people just can't partake in. And sometimes the easier call to action might actually not even do as much, right? Like, oh, recycle, or, oh, make sure that you buy carefully and stuff like that. Well, is that really impacting a lot of things? And then the other side of it, right, is like the media aspect, where it's like, why aren't the media really, really going after these high polluters, the military, and all these other industries that are really causing a lot of this pollution, right?
I love that story. It's so true, because I think sometimes we think of activism just in terms of like, okay, we do this, then we get that thing we want. But no, I mean, a lot of people don't really know what we're talking about a lot of the time, which is fine. I get it. People have more complicated lives than ever, right? People are working longer hours for less pay. We need this like disruptive, creative, big actions that you all are doing to interrupt that. And I think that's kind of beautiful. Matt, do you have anything to add to this? How do we create urgency?
Yeah, well, I think so. We have one thing. So it's like communicating what's happening with the climate crisis, ecological crisis is one thing. And then talking about why that's happening in a direct way is another. And then understanding, to what others allude to, like how those things are caused and reproduced in these systems of inequality, capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, everything down the line. And, it's not just this sort of disembodied greenhouse gas emissions in the case of the climate crisis, or, deforestation, or all these other environmental problems. It's like pollution is a social relation. It's a power relation. And, there's material reasons that these things are happening. And so what I'm always trying to be cognizant of when I'm talking about these problems is to always be connecting them to action, calls to action that people can do. And to Jay's point, like actions that are actually in line with the crises that could like be moving us down the line to try and to seriously mitigate and adapt to them. So that doesn't mean like changing individual consumption habits, but it means, I think some of the ways we sometimes talk about individual versus collective action are a little bit misleading, in my opinion, because it's like, well, we need both, because collective action is a series of individuals deciding over and over again to act in certain ways, right? I think it can be, a little bit problematic to there's a way in which it takes away people's agency to say, like, well, nothing I do matters. Well, no, what you do matters. It's just not in the ways that maybe the mainstream media is telling you, right? So, and to me, that means meaningfully affecting this crisis means organizing, and that means embedding people in ways they can act collectively together, embedding people in new forms of social relations, new ways of relating to each other and the ecosystems we inhabit and the rest of the world.
Yeah, I really like that. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which, brings me into my next question. The climate crisis is already happening, right? So it's like when we talk about like, oh, if we don't act now, okay, it's already happening. And so that is going to necessitate what you're talking about, Matt, like both taking care of each other and organizing for the policy change we need. And all of it is predicated on a new way of relating to one another and a new way of viewing, our lives, relationship with resources and even work and all of that, which brings me to my next question. So a lot of times when you hear about the climate crisis, it's like, don't you care what's going to happen to your kids and grandkids? And that's so weird to me, because that you're asking people to exert this large amount of empathy when the climate crisis is already happening. How do you all think we get better at messaging around the fact that, like, it's already here? Whether you have kids or not, whether you care about your kids or not, you should at the very least care about what's happening around us.
Yeah, jumping in. I mean, that's a really tough one. And I think that's where I think a lot of people in the media sort of industry sort of struggle on can we call it a crisis? Right? It was climate change. And then that we finally were able to call it a climate crisis at some point. And that was even a huge step. And so, like, to even get to that point, it took a lot of years and a lot of effort, it seemed. And so, like, right, we're up against the whole industry, and mainstream news and the corporate media structure is definitely tied into that oil-based fossil fuel extraction industry, capitalism, and all of the sort. And so we're really up against all of the tools that they have. And so I think that, like, what's been mentioned a little bit, just within trying to get people to act with these call to actions, or I like what Matt mentioned too, was like, even your individual actions might not be what it's told, but it is something, and it creates this collective action if everybody's doing it. And so, but yeah, I think that in general, when it comes to the messaging, another part of that that's really sort of interesting to me, well, maybe not interesting, it's very obvious, right? Society is very inequality based. And when you have a lot of the people that are being threatened and mostly killed from these violent storms that are created, it's not rich white people. I think we just saw what Florida just had, a couple enclaves of sort of really rich white folks that had all their stuff sort of destroyed, right? And that's messed up. But also, like, that was interesting to watch some of that coverage, which I haven't really seen too much, but like watch some of it and how they portrayed that compared to how they portrayed South Carolina, or, like Fort Myers compared to South Carolina. How did we, and so, like, a lot of that, I think, is just in general, how do we combat that? I think that's where alternative media comes from, or comes into play. And I think that also that's where independent media, and that's where independent journalists and even organizers such as on this panel come into play, where they can create that push and help to create, the press release, the wordings behind why we're doing this. It's very important. And I think a small, tiny thing here, we had encampment evictions be a very big thing in Minneapolis lately. I'll go back real quick too. Unicorn Riot is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization. So we do media. And so that's where I'm mostly talking about my experiences from. But in Minneapolis just had encampment evictions a lot. The corporate news was continually talking about the encampment evictions from the police perspective, continually. finally an encampment eviction happened recently, and there was a press release from the people. And so that was like a counteract towards the press not wanting to hear the people, just taking the police story and then utilizing that need to tell people what your story is and how, or what the people's story is, and then putting that out there. So I think that that's where Jay, Matt, and Alice come into hand, where it's really important, where we have people that are directing the media to tell the proper story, because I think that that's where a big part of it is as well. These folks in the corporate news, they'll sit at their desk and they'll hear the police report, or they'll hear the bank report based on that protest. This is what the bank statement said. They'll have 2 tweets from some Twitter that will describe the community said, but like, where's the full context, right? And so I think that that's where it's really important, where, you know, we got Jay writing books, we got Matt doing his thing, and Alice doing. So I think that that's where, like, we really need to have, maybe it's already there, right? We just need to be more pushing it, I guess, you know. But I think it's mostly on like the mainstream side of things, where we can, if independent media can help push, alternative media can help push, then you got the activists, the organizers helping to convey. I think that that's where we can maybe start to have a little bit impact in the crisis and the discussion around the crisis.
Yeah, I love that, especially because climate genocide, environmental racism, these are things that are not being given the center, because the climate crisis is not impacting everyone equally, both in different geographies and different countries. But it's also like, one thing I think about a lot is the fewer resources you have, the closer you are to nature, right? If you don't have the money to travel out of a hurricane, that makes you incredibly vulnerable in a way it doesn't if you can just be like, well, you see the weather's bad, I think I'll just leave. And that's yeah, I really appreciate that, Nico, because you're right. We just have to tell the true story and gradually take over. Jay, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh my God, so much. We could talk about, you and I could talk about this for an hour, but to touch on a couple points, I think that it's important to have empathy for people, to try to meet them where they're at. Realize that most people are conditioned by corporate news, that it's just that the business model is based on pumping fear into their living room, their TV set, to hijack their amygdala and their brainstem. It's like that's actually designed that way. So realize that most people have been conditioned to be individuals, conditioned to feel that they don't have any power. They have destroyed all of our social systems. Like, we used to have Elks clubs and used to know your neighbors. People don't know their neighbors now. So I think that COVID actually presented us with an incredible opportunity, introducing us to mutual aid. I think that is an incredible opportunity for local leaders to connect with their community and have face-to-face discussions while providing for their communities. And I think that's a wonderful tactic. But also don't underestimate the power of a call to action, right? Anybody can do it. Nico was talking about defund DAPL. I actually got teary-eyed hearing about that because we helped launch that. And that started with my Indigenous organizer friend at Indigenous Peoples Day in 2016 saying, hey, who's got their money in these banks? And then I heard that and I went, oh my God, that's it. That's it. And I remembered about Bank Transfer Day during Occupy, where they asked people to take their money out of the banks because of bank fees, or because of ATM fees or something. And then I reached out to Susan Sarandon, and we did this big call to action. Now, not everybody has access to a celebrity like that, which is understandable. But if George hadn't done that at that speech, I wouldn't have had that idea. And then I could have never dreamed that call to action would have spread like wildfire. And mostly people were finding out about that because people like Nico were on the front lines at Standing Rock with a cell phone and a Wi-Fi signal, live streaming to the. And I know what you do is a little more involved in that, but the point is that anybody can do this. So I think being bold. Be bold, and mighty forces will come to your aid. Simple actions that people can do, call them in. And I do think internally, even in the climate movement, we need to have our own sort of come to Jesus moments because we kind of I think this is a time that we really need to escalate. And lastly, the last point I want to make is thinking we tend to be very reactive and making people wrong. Okay. So I think anytime we can meet people where they're at, not make them wrong, talk in the language of their listening, we tend to use a lot of jargon. I think if we can get out of using jargon, it's helpful because most people don't know what you're talking about. And it's kind of like that Plato's allegory of the cave. People are and now instead of the shadows on the wall, people have their cell phones and they only have the information pumped into them. So in the allegory of the cave, the prescription is to have sort of a humility and openness to respect the other person's right to their own opinion and try to meet them where they're at and sort of lead them. But above all, I would say boldness and be conscious of controlling the narrative, not just reacting. Frank, Nico mentioned climate change. Climate change was a tactic from those right-wing think tanks that Alice was talking about. He consciously changed it from global warming to climate change to sort of de-escalate the urgency of it. So the opposition, the fossil fuels, are highly strategic, and our activist world, we tend to be more reactive than anything. So I think we need to continue to bring our come together and think strategically. So
Hard agree. Jay, when you were talking about the fear thing, I was reminded of, I have a British friend. He was like, when I watch American news, it's just like fear and murder constantly. And it's like, yeah, I mean, we can do better. We can give people a vision of what to fight for instead of just sort of marinating in mania and anxiety. Matt, do you have any thoughts on this? How do we bring home to people that this is impacting us now and it's something that we share?
Yeah, so I mean, it can be kind of a tricky balance, especially in the United States. There's we have this, like you're alluding to, is a disproportionate impacts, on the global South and poor and Black and brown communities, both externally to the United States, but then that's also like internally in the United States. We're seeing with, as I was alluding to, like in hurricane damage in the Southeast or the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi, and historical environmental injustices. So I think, it's really important to communicate how these sorts of natural disasters, ecological problems are connected to the climate and ecological crises, and then also connect them to, as I was talking about before, and as Alice was talking about, other social, racial, economic forms of inequality, these systems of power relations, and how these things are deeply intertwined. I think there's a way that a lot of people, often well-meaning, talk about the climate crisis and say like, oh yeah, we need to fix this, but it's the right thing to do to fight for climate justice alongside that and ameliorate these other harms. But it's kind of like a nice add-on. But to me, it's like they're fundamentally intertwined, and you can't really solve one without the other. So it has to be addressed simultaneously. And that affects the way that you view the crisis, and also like how to, what you should do to actually stop it. So I think, really, I think the key to that is solidarity. Solidarity is the key to our salvation. And solidarity is a verb. It doesn't just mean saying like, yeah, I have solidarity with those people suffering. It means actually putting that into action and organizing to, in your community, organizing to change those power relations. And because, really internalizing the idea that you're not free until everyone's free, even if you're temporarily maybe not affected by one immediate crisis, it definitely could hit you tomorrow.
So true. And I, feel like the climate is kind of a metaphor for that, right? The pandemic too. There is no way to individualize any of these problems, even if they're hurting one group or one person more at a specific time. Alice, how do you feel about all this?
Yeah, I definitely, I think, resonate with the idea that when we tell the story of the climate crisis as a future event, it's incorrect factually, and it also does not provide the sort of political will, the impetus for folks to get involved in protest movements and in social movements. Like I've actually been working on a campaign for about a year now, tracking ABC News, which is the largest broadcast news network in the country, as many of you probably know, and how they cover climate change on their nightly news show. And it's abysmal, as you can probably imagine, but they've gotten slightly better over the past summer. But you can see that they tell more stories about the vineyards in southern France than they do about the heat waves in China, for example. Like you can just tell that there's a difference in what kind of focus they shine, both in terms of the number of minutes that they spend reporting on it, but also just in terms of the kinds of stories. In the vineyards in southern France, it's, oh, let's interview a guy who's lost his crop, and this is a very human, very sort of empathy inducing story. We can all kind of relate to the sort of, or we can all kind of have empathy for like the financial precarity that you can tell the guy's going through, the trauma, so on and so forth. And in the same way, maybe not necessarily actually putting in front of the camera somebody who lost their home in flooding in Pakistan. So there's just many different ways in which you can tell that the reporting is different. And so I think as messengers, within the movement, we have to be very sort of strategic about that. I used to be the global media coordinator of Extinction Rebellion, which meant I helped run all the global XR accounts on social media. It also meant that I liaised with groups from around the world. XR has thousands of groups around the world. And, I help liaise with all of them and collect stories. And we had to be very sort of strategically minded about highlighting stories, both individual stories as well as stories of actions and groups from around the world, making sure that the focus wasn't just on, the biggest XR groups, which are naturally in the UK where it started and across Western Europe. And, thinking through how do you message that in a way that lands with these global audiences, but also, does justice to the stories of folks in the global South, folks who are fighting different kinds of fights and doing different kinds of actions. And, so we thought very strategically about that. And, thinking about the role, the responsibility that these mainstream sort of climate movements have towards frontline indigenous groups, towards smaller chapters of the said mainstream climate movement, and so on and so forth. And also thinking strategically as well about XR being part of a movement ecosystem, and thinking, well, we represented a certain kind of audience that wanted to follow XR, but we should also work in partnership with both more mainstream groups, but also other kinds of groups. And so, what kind of sort of audience are we capturing versus our partners and allies that have different kinds of audiences with different kinds of interests. So I think, this is like comms 101, I guess. It's like, speak to your audience. You learn basic things like that from the get-go. And I think the last thing I wanted to talk about is, to that end, I think, it is really important to platform different kinds of stories, both as a movement storyteller and, if you run social media accounts or, press outlets and so on, but also, obviously pressuring mainstream media, corporate media to do the same. But I also do, honestly, like, this is maybe pessimistic, I do think sometimes people have limits to their empathy. Like, it is going to be difficult for somebody to, in the United States, somebody who maybe isn't from doesn't have family, in certain places, to fully understand what it's like, right now in Central America, in the droughts in Madagascar, in Pakistan, so on and so forth. So I obviously think it's really important to have more storytelling around that. But I also do think people naturally have limits to what they can understand, and people care most about the issues that directly relate to them. So to that end, I think as grassroots organizers, when we do our outreach and when we try to get communities together and amplify community stories, we should always be thinking, what kind of community are we speaking to? When I go speak to folks who are from poor African American communities, I'm telling the story of how in red line neighborhoods or formerly red line neighborhoods, it's hotter nowadays in those neighborhoods than it is in non-red line neighborhoods. But when I go speak with community members who are from Central America, I'm talking about the impact of climate change on droughts and on climate migration, and when I go speak to my own father, I'm talking about the drought, the heat waves, the longest in human history that are still happening actually in China. So, I think it is kind of important although it's important to highlight these stories for everybody and on as big of platforms as possible, ultimately people are going to relate most to stories that they can relate to. And so it is also important when we kind of like segment, to use a fancy comms, term, when we segment our audiences, whether it's in a formalized way through media channels or just like as a grassroots organizer, if you're doing outreach, you're trying to get people to do something for you or with you, to speak to them and speak to them on their terms and what they can most relate to. So I think that is the last thing. That's, I guess, the caveat to what I was saying before, which is that we should tell these stories more to everyone. The caveat is that we should also tell stories that speak to people directly in the way that lands with them the most. So.
Yeah, no, it's so important because you're right. It's both. We need to be telling way more stories, way more diverse stories, and also be realistic about human nature, especially because empathy overload is just so difficult right now anyway. As Jay was saying, it's like we're not in the cave, we're in our phones. And if we're already overstimulated, it's like, okay, how do we make sure we're telling stories that will actually connect with people instead of just shut them down? But yeah, still, I personally am not most concerned about vineyard owners in southern France. I'm just going to put that out there. So our final question, and I really want to hear from each of you on this one because you've really been doing the work for so long, and I'm so grateful for everything all of you are doing. The theme of this conference is democracy in crisis. How do you see the climate crisis setting us up for the trends of fascism, authoritarianism, reactionary politics that, I wish were exclusive to the US, but unfortunately are popping up everywhere? Like, how do you see these dynamics as playing into one another? Alice, you want to go first?
Yeah, this is honestly something that, I kid you not, guys, keeps me up at night. Like I have nightmares about this every couple of weeks, to be honest. I think the reason, which I'm sure most of the audience members here are probably, know, is that obviously as our systems get increasingly destabilized, our natural systems and our ecological systems get increasingly destabilized, it's going to result in more migration, which is not only traumatic for people who have to be forced out of their land, but also, is going to create more political instability, is going to give more fuel for right-wing xenophobes who use immigrants and matters related to diversity and so on as scapegoat matters to push far-right agendas. This is like, I feel like tale is all the time, basically. And unfortunately, I do think in the 2020s, you're going to see more of it. And 2020s and beyond, I should say, you're going to see more of it. And so I think, I guess I wanted to say another thing, which is that I recently read this book by Andreas Malm with a collective of scholars in Sweden who are all researching far-right political ecologies. It's called White Skin, Black Fuel, and it looks at the long history in about a dozen European countries, as well as the United States and Brazil, the long history that far-right operatives have with liaising with the fossil fuel industry to push narratives of climate denial and push back on climate action as in a strategic way that is intertwined with their messaging around rising immigration in places like Sweden and Germany and so on, especially after 2015. And we're seeing the fruits of some of that in that, naturally climate action hasn't moved anywhere as quickly as it needs to be, but you also see the fruits of that in the recent Italian and Swedish elections, for example. Obviously also, Brexit and, Trump and Bolsonaro. So I think it's a really interesting book. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but I do recommend everybody check it out. But I guess for me, this goes back to what I'm always thinking about, which is messaging about the climate and ecological crisis in an intersectional way. And I think I was talking earlier about inequality and thinking about the ravages of like wage labor and, like not being able to afford anything and so on and so forth, but also, thinking about democracy, the crisis of democracy. Polling consistently shows that for the 2022 midterm elections, democratic elections and our democratic institutions are number one or in the top 2 or 3 issues for many, many, many voters. And so I think, we should, sort of message around the climate crisis, not just as a matter of there's going to be bigger floods, there's going to be bigger heat waves. I think the focus on climate disasters is really important naturally, because of course, if you're flooded out, that's it, that's your big crisis of the moment. But I do also think that I don't think as many movement practitioners or also just general, sort of like how people talk about climate change, I don't think as much of it focuses on droughts, on failure of crops, failure of economies, the need for people to move. And we here, I'm preaching to the choir here, we all know that climate migration is going to be a massive issue. But I think the mainstream reporting and the way that I see, NGOs and social movements message around climate change is always thinking about the next big Hurricane Sandy. It's going to be horrible. And I definitely, think that's an important message as well. But we should also be thinking about, think about how people are going to have to move, and this is going to create even more issues regarding, far-right xenophobia and how that's going to destabilize our democratic institutions further. I think for me, that is actually one of the scariest things about the climate crisis. One of the reasons why I initially decided to take a lot of action on it. Like I said at the beginning, it definitely keeps me up sometimes. And I think that more people should be messaging around that, because it strikes at the heart of not just climate emergency and climate and ecological emergency, but also the democratic crisis that we're experiencing, across the world. And I think that if you combine messaging around those 2 issues, that can be a very potent mix.
Yeah, Alice, I really want to find that book now. But yeah, it's something that I think it's hard to internalize, maybe because maybe it doesn't say great things about human nature, but like great instability and fascism are just always going to go hand in hand in some form throughout history. I don't know why that's why humans are. Maybe it's as simple as when we feel powerless, it's more seductive to, maybe it's more just that like it's easier to seize power when things are unstable. But yeah, everything you said, just 100%. It's scary. Jay, I know this is something you spend a lot of time thinking about as well. We're all having the same nightmares. It's great.
Yeah, it's terrifying because, as Alice was talking about, neoliberalism is a global phenomena. Neo-fascism is a global phenomenon, and the 2 track. So when you have periods of inequality, gross income inequality, instability, this makes it easy for strong men to step up, because it tends to go in one of 2 directions: FDR and unions targeting the super wealthy, or scapegoating immigrants and fascism. And so that's historically been true. And I think we need to have the vision to realize, as the climate apocalypse it continues to escalate beyond the point that we can really track. Like we actually don't know how bad it is going to get. We're getting past the point where we can actually measure it. Realize that in those periods of instabilities, we are looking at potentials for George Miller, Mad Maxian, like the latest Mad Max Fury Road. Like those scenarios are definitely in play. The prescription, in my opinion, is as Matt said, solidarity. Okay, so part of the strategy, in my opinion, is again getting out of the silos. Now think about, even in the movement, how often we are operating within our own organization, within our own, little niche. And that's also, as the people are in their comfort zones, they don't want to get out of their comfort zones and think about these things because it's scary. They're just trying to survive late stage capitalism and put food on the table. We also get to challenge ourselves and get wildly outside of our comfort zones. That is my belief. And part of that, in my opinion, is breaking down the psychic barriers, as we've been talking about in this panel: racial justice, climate justice, health justice, unhoused justice. These are all interdependent issues. They are not separate issues, okay? this is, in my opinion, this is going to be the crux of this is going to be, especially on a local level. Like really, when we're talking about democracy, it's very hard to shift things on a federal level. It is enormously difficult. And sometimes we jump right to, oh, I'm going to run for Congress. Great, you should. That's a great way to build a platform. And there's a ton that can be won on a local level. I was part of a group of a handful of millennials that pushed city council to divest $8 billion from Wells Fargo. Okay, organizing against Wells Fargo straight up and won. They passed public banking on a state level. Okay, they had no resources whatsoever. So on a local and state level, a lot can be won. But in my opinion, it really we get to challenge ourselves. Okay, we get to challenge ourselves to get out of our little bubbles and to stop doing the thing that we always do. Okay, and also recognize that a lot of organizations are just raising money, and that in itself is a racket. I'm sorry, it's a racket. So, anyways, that's how I feel. Also, I do encourage people. I spent 5 years writing this book because there's so much to unpack here, but there are, even when there is the rise of a strong man like Milosevic. Look at Otpor in Yugoslavia. They actually were able to win against an incredibly destructive dictator using an inside-outside strategy. They had an inside coalition strategy, really simple: vote them out. Outside strategy: disrupt. And a lot of their tactics were fun and entertaining and captivating people's imaginations. So, but Jocelyn, you and I could talk about this for hours. So I'm gonna step back.
No, we should forever with everyone. Nico, do you have any thoughts on this before we transition into our next panel?
Yeah. I think that, what was brought up is really good. Alice and Jay, you bring up really good points. I'm excited to hear yours, Matt, as well. But I think that when we're looking at how society goes in these crisis moments and how people gravitate towards accepting authoritarianism, it's definitely a real issue. And I think that in general, when it comes to alternative media or independent media and how to combat that, what I think of is utilizing these messages that have already been spoken about. And also, I really like that idea of relating, right? And so like having a story that's relatable, that'll actually show people how some of these authoritarian acceptances are actually very demeaning for themselves for maybe a century, you know what I mean? Or for decade, I should say, for years, it'll have these problems that'll have tentacles inside of this, fracturing different parts of society. And so anyways, I really love the idea of around mutual aid as well, and utilizing people's collective strength and collective togetherness. And I think that what was brought up earlier was really how we saw it materialize more so in America during COVID than we had in other times. It always comes around during, Sandy or Katrina or all these other flashpoint moments, as was talked about. But then, like, how are we doing that on the whole and in the everyday local level, as was just brought up, right? And so I think I look at those things and I think about how important those are. And also, you could have the most radical local politicians, but sometimes that still won't make moves in your local area. And so I think that that's where it's really, really important on the people who are just everyday characters in the neighborhood to just do their thing, right? Like make your mutual aid organization, make your crew do that thing. Go support the houses, go support the people who are, trying to clean up this creek or whatnot, right? And so that's another side of things. It's like, we were going through this massive drought as well, especially in the Midwest. And I heard, Alice, you talking about China's massive, right? So like maybe the biggest ever. And how do you even get people to care about that? You can tell people can be like, oh yeah, well, what can I do about it, right? And so that's where I think that, like, again, that disconnect sort of comes apart or comes around. And that whereas media, whereas activists, we can sort of help push that back into the right direction. Like, well, actually, no, we can take an impact. We can move forward. there is the future. Obviously, we might not need to talk about the 7 generations, but we can talk about right now, and then relate to that. But I think in general, when it comes to just like these ideas coming together, I think it's very important to continue to focus on who is doing the negative interactions with society, right? And it seems like those are the huge banks, those are the big energy corporations that are still going after, small journalist outfits and small indigenous actors against Apple, right? They're having lawsuits against folks, and they're claiming, as sort of Jay brought up, that no, actually the energy corporations are claiming some of these environmental groups are doing this environmental work just to get money, and then that becomes an issue. Anyways, the whole point, I think, is like if we continue to have this push and not to stop, right? There's always flashpoints, and then there's moments of lull, right? And I don't think anybody on this panel or anybody that's even watching this is probably ever involved in a lull, because they're probably always continually organizing. But on the whole, you see it. And on the whole, when the movement stops, people stop caring outside and inside, it seems as well, where they might not do as much mutual aid. They might not do as much telling other people the stories that need to be told and talking about these situations. So in general, I think it's just really important for us to continue to be on it, talk about how it is, what it is. And the fascist creep is going to happen. But if we are collectively showing solidarity, as Matt brought up and was touched on, and continuing to have these mutual aid organizations or just like abilities with ourselves, that could help increase the conversation around not accepting such authoritarian or fascist creep to come in. Anyways, Matt, what was your last little things before I go back to you, before we get back to it?
So I think, I think we can see this sort of trajectory around, and it's already happening. Trump was elected and Bolsonaro was elected, and we're seeing the rise of far right around the world. And then we can see that intertwining with escalating climate and ecological breakdown, how those things can just continue to feed off each other and get worse, as others allude to. If you think about it too much, it'll keep you up at night. But I think it's important to keep in mind that human nature is not a meaningful concept to me, because I think that our behaviors and our understandings of the world are fundamentally shaped by our material conditions and our interactions with the world. And so to think about how the sorts of individualism and the artificial scarcity of capitalism and colonialism shape these behaviors, and to understand that when we have these like natural disasters like we're seeing, most people, even under those conditions, respond by helping each other and working together, and not in a sort of fascist type response that you might some people might expect. And I think it's important to view the climate and ecological crisis as a democracy crisis, and seeing those things as intertwined, because nobody wants to suffer from pollution, right? Like that's why the most pollution is always in the poorest and racialized communities, right? So like if we had a democratic society, they would not let that happen, but because they lack the power to stop it, it happens. So we can think of ecological crisis and democracy crisis as a feedback loop that fuel each other. So we have to take a more expansive view of democracy and understand that what we have right now is not really democratic. It could get less democratic, which I don't want, but we have to have an expansive view, offer an expansive view of democracy where people have meaningful agency over their lives, not just voting at the ballot box, their workplaces, and everything else. And to me, that's what socialism is.
I love the idea of us just sort of creating our alternate society within the shambles of whatever it is we're being subjected to now. And I mean, I think that's how people have always fought fascism, which is really super effective. Thank you so much for everybody. Nico, Matt, Alice, Jay, do you guys want to do a just quick goodbye with where people can find you and your work? Jay?
Sure. You can, there's a free sample chapter, bonus chapter, based on an article I wrote called 27 Reasons Trump Won That Have Nothing to Do with Susan Sarandon. Talks very much about all the things we're talking about at betherevolution.us.
Awesome. Nico?
Yeah, I'm Unicorn Riot's work is at unicornriot.ninja. We're across social media. I have my own little website I got going, nicog.work, and I'm on social media, Mr. Nico G. But yeah, check out Unicorn Riot. We have a lot of things. And we're talking about Dapple. We have a full-length documentary, Black Snake Killers and No Dapple Story. And thanks, Jay, for talking about the defund joint. That was amazing flag drop, and thanks for working on that project.
Thank you. Alice?
Gosh, I'm really bad at this kind of stuff because I don't like having internet presence. But so you can check out my Twitter, which is at tweets by ANH. Those are my initials. It's the most underwhelming Twitter content you'll ever see. But my DMs are open. So if anybody wants to talk further or collaborate on something, I'm super excited to hear from you. I'm actually a very bad Gen Z millennial cusper. So
that's good. You're spending your time actually organizing. That's good. And Matt?
I'm on Twitter at MJ Haugen, and my newsletter is called Terrain at terrain.substack.com.
Thank you so much to all of you. I'm feeling, ironically, perhaps because these are not the most lighthearted topics, I'm feeling very inspired by everything you all do, and thank you for being here. And every day, everything you contribute to this movement. So next up, we're going to be hearing from some more wonderful people. Hi, Alana. How are you? How are you?
Okay, now we're unmuted. Okay.
It's got to happen. It's just how it is. And yes, I it over to you. Thank you for being here. Very excited to hear about everything thrilling happening in the labor movement. Is that correct?
That is correct. So thanks so much, Jocelyn. I'm Ilana Levin from New Media Mentors and Organizing 2.0. Welcome to our final panel of the day, the rebirth of a labor movement. Earlier in the ongoing COVID pandemic, people started to realize how much they depended on essential workers or working people that kept us all fed and cared for. Unfortunately, this understanding didn't extend to lasting public policy changes. In fact, right now, workplace safety rulings that helped limit COVID spread from becoming even worse are being dialed back or even eliminated. With a significant percentage of the population unable to work, those who must still work are realizing the power that they can truly wield over whether our society can even function. And as a result, we're experiencing the biggest wave of worker organizing in any of our lifetimes. The younger, the older, this is the biggest we've experienced. Workers from Amazon to Starbucks, to teachers and nurses, are all organizing at scale, both large and small. In fact, I just heard about a tiny climbing gym in Brooklyn that's now starting to organize yesterday. And a lot of that can be credited to social media tools like TikTok and Twitter that have allowed organizers to reach out each other and the general public in ways that they couldn't really do before. Our panelists today have a wide perspective on the current state of labor in the USA, and I will let them introduce themselves, starting with Casey. Casey Kennedy, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name is Casey Moore. I am with Starbucks Workers United. Sorry about the bad phone quality. We had a last minute concert with Billy Bragg on our picket line. So I couldn't miss that, but I couldn't miss this too. So thanks for bearing with me. And I am a barista at Starbucks, part of the organizing committee, and I also help run our communications for the national campaign. So I love talking about TikTok, and I could talk about the power of social media in organizing with the labor movement all day. So thanks for having me.
Fabulous. Also joining me are Nicole McCormick from the West Virginia Education Association.
Yeah, I'm more representing, even though I am a WVEA member, the West Virginia United Caucus, which was born out of our historic statewide strikes in 2018 and 2019. And I was a music educator. I'm a mother to 4 kids under 12 and still organizing in a very unique environment. So like West Virginia is its own bear. Like every single district went for Trump and Bernie. Like it's a very wonderfully unique place. But yeah, that's what I do. I'm an organizer for other education employees, not just teachers.
Oh, okay, fabulous. Thank you. And joining me is my frequent co-conspirator, CM Files. How are you doing?
Good. Hey, Alana. Super excited to be here. I am the Treasurer and Fundraising Director over at Pride at Work, which is a constituency group of the AFL-CIO, which works with our LGBTQIA plus members to demand more in their workplaces for queer issues and to work in collaboration and coordination with our other constituency groups across our locals, across our international unions, and I'm super excited to be here.
Fabulous. And last but not least is Hamilton Nolan, one of our best labor journalists. Hi, Hamilton. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, one of the only labor journalists. My name is Hamilton Nolan. I'm a labor reporter for a long time, written for Gawker, Guardian, In These Times Magazine, and some other places, and currently writing a book about the labor movement, and a member of the Writers Guild East, one of the unions helping unionize the media also. So thanks
And
for
where
having
I
me.
used to work as communications director. So
Perfect.
thank you for joining us all. So we've seen an amazing growth of labor organizing in the last few years. What do each of you think is responsible for that shift? Do you want to start with that, Hamilton?
I think inequality is responsible for it. 40 years of inequality, there has to be a breaking point, and organized labor is really the single strongest tool that people have. So even with all the obstacles that have been erected in America, at a certain point it's inevitable that inequality gets so bad and the American dream gets so beaten down that people return to the idea of organized labor. And I think that's in the big picture, that's what you're seeing happen now, although there's obviously a lot of nuance that we can go into also.
Thank you. Anyone else want to respond to that?
I think sometimes the lack of, I apologize, CM. I think sometimes like the lack of avenue for how to address issues also spurs it on. If you live in a right to work state and you have no collective bargaining, you have no way to do anything, you're looking around at each other and you're like, how are we going to address this? And you're like, well, we can strike. I mean, like your labor is something that belongs to you. You get to choose if you want to give it or withhold it. Mm-hmm. And I think that like that Hamilton was saying, born out of this like desperation and necessity is you looking at what is your value to other people and to the people that you work with, and how can you leverage that to make action happen when you can't just, play nice and ask for things.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Sam.
Just going to jump in and say, I think access to information has been a big driver. I think we're seeing the rise of the independent union. And I spent a couple of years with the Campaign Workers Guild, organizing campaign workers and nonprofit workers across the country, and seeing that these folks could just demand more in their workplace and could withhold their labor. And we had a campaign that was a pretty high-profile campaign, strike right before the Iowa caucuses and hold all of their labor, and showing that workers coming together have so much more power. And then having folks like Hamilton who are out there who are able to write about it and tell our stories, which we need more of. We need more labor journalists and journalists that understand our issues, that come from a place of seeking to understand, as opposed to writing from a corporatist view. And so I'm super excited by the folks that, have risen up and the rise of the independent union. Not to say that there's not a place for large institutional unions, but the independent union is definitely on the rise, and as a member of one, it's I definitely feel welcome and at home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And Casey.
I was just going to add, I actually think that, a lot of people asked us why we were organizing, why Starbucks workers were organizing. And a lot of people wanted to point towards the pandemic as the reason. And I just want to make it clear that these are issues that have been building up for a long time. And it wasn't just the pandemic. I think maybe that sped things up, but Starbucks workers have been organizing or have been thinking about organizing for years. So I think it's really just, having the ability to have workers be able to do that. And, what we said from the start at Starbucks was it just takes one store to show that you can do it. And that's what we're fighting for right now, is the right to organize with this company. Obviously, we're fighting for a contract and all of those things as well, but we're fighting for the right to collectively bargain and to have a democratic voice in the workplace. So I think, it's just kind of this domino effect of workers being like, oh, wait, we have power and we can do this by organizing together. And it's a really incredible thing to be a part of and really inspiring to see other workers doing it across the country.
I mean, I think that's a really good point about the fact that people have been working on this for a long time. And one of the differences that I saw, earlier, I would say, 10 years ago and earlier, was that you would have these individual, what we would call hot shops, which would be individual work sites where a small number of people, because only a small number of people worked there in the first place, would be organizing a union, but nobody outside of that immediate area would hear about it. And partially that was because, while we have had labor media, it wasn't being read by people in other locations who would have seen that story and said, oh, if they're doing it in Topeka, I can do that in Buffalo, or vice versa. And so I think one of the changes has been that people who are doing these hot shops actually can see and hear from each other. And they're not just waiting on the corporate media, who is systematically disinterested in covering worker organizing, to know what each other are doing. So like with your job site, like, were you seeing, I'm not sure where in the order of organizing any of this happened, but like, how much of it was a factor? Was it a factor for you guys to see that other places were doing it? And where did you first encounter stories of this happening? For Casey.
Yeah, I mean, I saw the first introduction really to the labor movement that I had was watching the Bessemer Amazon workers organize. And that was so inspiring to see. And then I think with Starbucks, I think Starbucks is a brand too. Every person has a connection to Starbucks. Like it's on almost every street corner across America. And so I think when we started organizing, it was that people's connection to that they knew their baristas, they see them every day, and the fact that there was 9,000 Starbucks stores, corporate Starbucks stores in the United States, and not a single one of them had been unionized. I mean, we didn't have to fight for media. Media came to us for like a lot of months. We were kind of just fielding interviews, and it was incredible. And, it's been incredible to see other people being able to organize from that. But I think, we've been incredibly, it was just an insane influx of media from the second we launched our campaign until now, even as we go into the contract fight as well.
Well, you guys have been some of the most digitally savvy organizing ever, basically. And I think one of the things that has been unique with it, and that has, I think, inspired how things are done elsewhere, is that the Starbucks workers are very visibly managing their own social media accounts for their own stores in their own voices. I started doing digital labor movement in like 2006 or 7. And back in those days, if I wanted to post anything, it had to go through 5 lawyers. By that point, every bit of personality had been drained from the content and the news cycle had moved on to something else. how did you guys start with your social? So, and I know from like the folks at the union that they like actually are supporting you guys going and having your own voice. They're not trying to shut you down, which is like a thing that was happening constantly back in my day. How did you go about like launching the online presence for Starbucks Workers United, and how connected are you to other groups in other states and cities that are organizing too?
Yeah, so we launched our social media accounts basically right before we went public with the campaign while we were having our organizing committee meetings. That was something that we had all been working on together, because also a lot of Starbucks baristas and organizers are kind of millennial Gen Z. So we're all comfortable and on these social media platforms ourselves. And so that was something that, this campaign and nationally has been largely run by committees. So we have a TikTok committee, we have a Twitter committee, and I think that it's been a really fun way to combat the company's anti-union campaign as well. I think, Elena, you had mentioned the rock gym, the rock climbing gym that was organizing, and they tried using memes, and we like quote tweeted it, and we were like, who's going to tell them that you can't use memes when you're the oppressor? It's not funny anymore. And so I think we've been able to use humor and memes and TikTok trends and things like that to kind of not only raise awareness and expose the company, but also just reach audiences that we would have never been able to reach, even with an article in the New York Times or something like that. One of our most popular video on TikTok has 30 million views, and we just wouldn't have been able to reach that on any other platform. And it's just been an incredible tool for our organizing.
Yeah, no, we were supposed to like live and die by getting our New York Times coverage, and it wasn't even considered that maybe the people we were seeking to organize weren't going to even see New York Times coverage. That it's not even what they would read, and certainly the numbers don't match as high as that. Sam, I know you've been around in this space for a long time. Like, what do you feel like has given us the freedom to be able to see all of these amazing worker accounts like posting directly and not going through 50 lawyers and just being out there?
I think it has to do with self-advocating internally. I wear a hat at the AFL-CIO and have had the opportunity to lead digital strategy efforts for the last couple of years. And the one thing I've been very grateful of is the opportunity to just write a tweet and tweet it, and to have to stand on my own laurels as a strategist, as a communicator, as a worker, to say, you hired me to do a job and trust me to do it. And we had lawyers that respected that and knew that I knew the bounds within to execute the work. And so sometimes you hit a line, and sometimes you have a conversation about what that line is. And sometimes you go a little far and you get a slap on the wrist. But I think oftentimes getting right up to the line is where we are finding that it's necessary to be able to communicate in a manner in which we're able to reach the folks that are most needing to be reached. It's also about building community and coalition and collaboration and building behind the scenes efforts and the networks that are necessary to be able to quickly engage and trick, if you will, the algorithms to determine that content is worthy of being promoted. And that takes time and effort. It takes, a lot of conversations, a lot of work on the back end. And I think it's all worth it. We build communities online around specific topics, around specific issues, but I think everybody in collaboration, together, being able just to like drop in a retweet and have 5 accounts that I can go into and drop retweets on, can ensure that the tweet may reach a couple thousand more people than it otherwise would have. And being able to do that for our allies in the programs that we're supporting as well is important. And so make friends with online accounts, make friends with large followers. I keep a couple in my back pocket that have very large followings. And if something is important and they need a retweet, or if Starbucks workers are tweeting and it's really important and it's not moving, then drop them a retweet. You don't need to tell them you're doing it, just do it, because it's for the better good for all of us that the communications that we're putting out that are oftentimes it's time sensitive and important are also raised to the same level as the playful fun memes that we're putting out on time as well.
So if for folks who are watching this who might not work for a union, might not be a union member, etc., like what is a meaningful thing that they can do to support unions online, CM?
I would say sign up for our email list. We won't spam you. We'll email you for what you want to engage in. But also go out and find a small union account. Follow them on Twitter. Take a look at who it suggests you to follow, because oftentimes it's going to suggest you to follow somebody else that is also a small union account. And I think I have lists that I personally look at, and I suggest that folks use Twitter lists. They're a relic of the past, but still very useful. And I think underutilized by folks today. But the other piece of it is just authentically share content. Add your own spin on it. Quote tweet content. Give it, drop a comment, even if it's just, dropping in to say hi. It still moves the needle in the algorithms. Mm-hmm. I think the other piece of it is find a local campaign you can get involved in and go devote some time to their organizing efforts. And if you can't, see if there's a way that you can support them online.
Thank you. Now, Nicole, teachers are an extremely intergenerational workforce and working with people of all ages, quite literally. How have you guys navigated social media and online communications with sometimes people with very different needs and what they're looking for and even where they're looking? I know that one of the greatest pre-TikTok, one of the greatest web videos of labor I ever saw in my life was from a teachers union doing like line dances during the LA teachers strike. So like you guys have some real history there. Do you have thoughts about how you guys have like navigated that as a very intergenerational group of workers?
Yeah, and like this kind of ties into Casey and Sam. Like it was vital to our success in 2018 and 2019 and since then. West Virginia is a very physically isolating place. Even pre-Janus, you didn't have to belong to a union. So we had 3 unions competing for membership. So you could belong to any of them, and not even really unions, but associations. Right. And so whenever things get bad enough and people go, holy crap, I can't afford to live here anymore, it spurs them into wanting to do something, but they didn't have an outlet. Like people in the same association were not talking to one another in different school districts. There was no communication. It was straight from leadership down and then down back up to leadership. There was no lateral communication. And we knew that Facebook was very popular with most folks, still is. And so we created a secret Facebook group, and there are only about 20,000 teachers in the state of West Virginia. And we went from about 30 people in August of 2017 to like 24,000 in January of 2018. We still have like 23,000 in the group. We decided that we needed to really fight for the common good. So we branched out from just teachers, just education employees, and we included all public employees. So we won a raise for people that did not even strike with us. And we felt like that was incredibly important because, we're all in this together. The saying, an injury to one is an injury to all is true. And if you want to be able to make life better, then you have to make the common good better. Like you have to focus on that. And some of the big issues talking about like that freedom to say what you want to say, when you're not an official union leadership, you just kind of get to the point of just not giving any shits. Like you just kind of go, I'm going to say what I need to say. And so you don't feel like that you are like beholden to the bureaucracy, and who cares if leadership wants to slap you on the wrist? It doesn't mean anything to you if they're not the ones putting their jobs on the line. And so you just kind of get to that point of being like very genuine. So, I mean, memes helped. We shared like asinine responses from legislators to one another. And this whole idea, like Casey talked about, well, if they can do it, I can do it. I mean, we had to teach people what's a walk-in what's a walkout? Like how do you structure test? How do you map your work site? Like these are all things that people kind of knew, but they didn't have a name for it. They didn't have like an official, this is how you do this step by step. And so we literally educated people through Facebook on how to do these things. And so it was and has been incredibly vital. I mean, West Virginia tends to be the butt of the joke. We're an extraction colony. People don't even think about us. Like we're very small. There's only 1.7 million people. We've been losing population since the 1950s. We're old, white, chronically ill. We have a huge opioid epidemic. And so it's like the only thing you ever hear is negative stuff. And so, like you said, it's like the national media just really didn't care. And so when all of these like socialist organizations and independent, labor media folks came in, they're like, holy crap, what's going on in West Virginia? And that spurred on to books. Me, as someone from generational poverty, I am the only person in my family to have a college education. And I've been able to travel around the country for the past 4 years talking about that. I might be the only West Virginian that people have met that they can have an actual connection with. And people are people everywhere. And poor and working class folks are the same everywhere. And we have the same issues. And so it's been like the greatest gift to be able to realize that my labor belongs to me, that I know what I'm talking about, and I don't have to have permission from anybody to fight for myself.
I love it. That's so powerful. What is a piece of advice you'd have for other unionists who are trying to grow their Facebook communities, especially when it's a secret group? You have to you have to know somebody in order to invite them, right?
Yeah. I mean, use the structures that you have, the social structures. Like there's always an unofficial leader in part of the work site. Like I knew that Miss Shrewsbury was the unofficial leader of the first grade teachers. They all went to her for advice. So even though that she had no official title, she's the person that I went to whenever I was trying to convince other people that may not listen to me that this is what needed to happen. And so, I mean, use what you already know. Like you're already plugged into so much. No matter your job, you have a community that you interact with. And then beyond that, that community has a community and communities. And it's just kind of branches out from that. I think that you need to think about what you feel is appropriate and post those rules at the top, and also be aware to revisit those. I think that you need a significant team of moderators. Like I lived with my phone in my hand for like 4 years, and it was incredibly distracting. I just remember like taking a bite, look at my phone, my husband being like, there's a 2-year-old over here. You gonna make sure she doesn't choke? Like while that you're like on your phone, because it just felt so immediate. Like it felt so important. So yeah, I mean, you need to make sure that you trust your instincts. I mean, you know if people are with you, if they're not. And you also know if people are in there just to cause problems. We did not add official union leadership. We did not add administrators. We did not add most legislators unless that they had some significant tie to public employees or educators. And I didn't have any qualms about kicking people out either. We also, I mean, West Virginia is very red, right? Yeah. So most of us as leaders are very left. And so we had to come to this point of being existing is political, but we're going to make sure that we try to stay as far away from partisan politics as possible. So no general statements. So I could call out an individual senator. Somebody else could call out an individual law. But as far as saying, all the Republicans are trash, or all the Democrats have done this, we made sure that people stayed away from that, because you're organizing with coworkers that probably didn't believe that COVID was real until their meemaw died. Yeah. I mean, so it's you have to be very conscious of sticking to the issues, because that's what matters. Can people drink their water? Can they pay their bills? Are their kids safe? That's what matters to people. So they can kind of get over the other stuff, as long as you're not making them feel like they have to be reactive in the way that you're presenting information.
Thank you. We'll be talking about some of those communications because I know what the theme of the conference is very much about anti-fascism. I know I'll want to draw some of that together in that conversation in just a little bit. Hamilton, how is social media and independent social media accounts from union members and people seeking to organize impacted how you guys are able to cover labor as labor journalists, and what are you looking for when you make decisions about what you're covering?
It definitely makes it easier to be a journalist because you can look on Twitter and see every single new union filing every day, and you can, in that sense, it's much easier to have that window into what's happening in a lot of different campaigns all over the country, and everybody should take advantage of that if you're organizing. I mean, and when we organized my workplace, Gawker Media, in 2015, we put up like a blog post and said, how are you going to vote on the union, before we had our election, and all the workers went in the comments and said like yes or no. And it kind of goes back to what you're talking about sort of unions being willing to open up and be less stuffy, and to kind of let the workers lead on communications and a lot of other things. And I think that there's a bit of a bigger story too, in the sense of like for these things to happen, you also need to have unions that have their priorities in order, in the sense of like they have to have the priority be organizing workers is the priority, right? So however we're going to get there, that's how we're going to get there. So if we need to let Caleb tweet things on Twitter that make the lawyers go crazy, like, then that's what we're going to do, because there's always a tendency within the institutions of the union worlds to kind of be more conservative, think more about protecting what we have, than to look out and think about what needs to be the top priority in the labor movement, which is organizing new workers, trying to get some sense of revival in this moment of opportunity that we have. So I think that all the people on this call, I mean, you look at the Starbucks workers, the West Virginia teachers, like all that energy was coming up from the grassroots, right? It was the workers pushing the unions and not vice versa. And what we need in the labor movement as a whole is like to take that grassroots energy, and the people that have that grassroots energy go in and take over the unions, go in and run for positions in the unions, take over the unions, and translate that into some institutional energy that we can keep this going for years to come. Because as you've been around this movement for a long time, like we're kind of on a high right now, but that ebbs and flows, and the politics get harder, and the NLRB will turn over, and Republicans will come back, and all this stuff will get harder. So we're in a moment of opportunity. So we need to think institutionally about what we can do now to build for the future.
It's so real. It's so real. A lot of studies over a long period of time have sort of indicated that one of the only significant ways to get white heterosexual Christian men to vote in ways other than conservative is for them to be union members. And so unions have historically served as a means of fighting fascism in the electorate, right? And unions are also one of the only spaces in which people who have very differing political beliefs and ideologies all have to become members of the same thing in order for it to exist. I think did we just lose? We just lost Nicole. I will bring this to her. Oh, Nicole, you're here. Okay, great.
Sorry, my husband was like, "Do you need me to get the kids off the bus?" And I was like, "Yes, get the kids off the bus." Sorry.
Oh, no, I'm so sorry. I was like, I just set up a thing I was going to ask you. Why didn't I look first? Okay, so I was going to say, so as someone who is, for example, moderating a community in which you have people of all different kinds of politics, and sometimes those politics end up with people saying things that are like literally triggering to oppressed people. And like, well, and yet we're all sort of in the same organization together. Like when I've had to deal with conversations with people to disarm anti-Semitism, I've had to deal with lots of like homophobia and transphobia. Like, how have you guys been able to moderate? Because like you mentioned a couple of those things, like in the Facebook group, but like, do you feel like having this Facebook space together is a productive way to fight people's like bigotries that they often show up with? Or how do you keep spaces ones that people can feel safe in and not get chased out of?
I do feel like that. I feel like that whenever that you have a group of moderators, you want to share the same values. Like you want to share the same goals and how that you want the space to be and how you want people to feel. And so like West Virginia has one of the coolest state mottos ever. It's called, the motto is "Mountaineers are always free." And so like those are things that are tangible to people. Like people in West Virginia, identify whether that they're right or left as defiant. Like there is this sense of things that are cultural that we have used to push that. Like recently, pride flags were banned in a county school system, and we as a caucus have been fighting back against that. And so we released a statement saying that, you know, Mountaineers were always free and that all were welcome here, and that we wanted to support all of our loved ones in the LGBTQ plus communities, and that our goal was to make a space open and safe and warm and loving for all children and the adults that cared for them. And so we got like a little bit of pushback, but whenever that we responded with firmness, but not in the sense of like attacking them as an individual, but being like, you know, this ideology is incorrect and it's not, it does not help a healthy environment for the children and the people of West Virginia. So it's like you kind of learn how to navigate that by what is kind of cultural to the space that you're in. I feel like that we all kind of have that innate ability to feel that. And I had a friend once tell me that I was really good at stepping on shoes without messing up the shine. And I don't know if that's always true, but I feel like that that's a really good way to stand firm to your values and stand up for people that need someone else to be a voice along with them, not speak for them, but be there to be supportive and to make sure that they shut down things that are not helping anybody and are making a place unsafe that people do not want to stay in and they will leave. You're losing power in your movement. So yeah, so I feel like there's a way to navigate it that is thoughtful about how people are going to respond. But at the same time, if someone's being a bigot or belligerent, or there is never any positive contribution, then they don't deserve to be there. Like, I mean, remove them. And that's just kind of the end of it.
Does anybody else want to respond to how unions operate, and is it anti-fascist, like cultural and social force among the members? Or,
I mean, I would just say this is a bit of what I'm writing about in my book too. I mean, it's, if you think about it, unions are like the only organization that really has the nature that you're talking about of like, it's not a selected group of people that go in it. You know, it's not people with political affinity that go in unions. It's everybody. Everybody here is in the union. And then you have to operate in a democratic manner. And it really, I think unions are actually like a school for democracy for regular people. You know, like if you're a normal person in America, you are not in any other democratic institution, probably. Nothing. Your work is not a democracy. The church is not a democracy. School is not a democracy. Family is not a democracy. Like a union is a place where you're like, wow, this is how a democratic institution actually works. And, you know, it's a pain in the ass to be in a union because of this, right? There's all these people that you have to deal with, but it does have what you're talking about, which is all these positive social effects of like, okay, here is how you solve problems democratically. Here is how you do this stuff. So, I mean, it's such a unique kind of opportunity, and it's like another really important reason to spread unions past 10% of the workforce.
Absolutely.
Can I add just one thought to that, just to clarify? So we have non-union members in our group too. Like, I feel like that it's so important to recognize that the people that you work with, they're always a potential member, even if they're not currently, and you need the non-union folks too to stand with you. You need them to be willing to walk. You need them to be willing to say no. And so making sure that you kind of get over that, well, they're getting the same benefits as me, but I'm paying dues. Just get over it. Like, you just kind of have to recognize, you get what I'm saying? Like, you just kind of have to recognize that these people that you work with, whether that they're union members or not, you need them. You need them to be part of the conversation to drive whatever the action is that you're doing.
You know, thank you. That's a good observation. I was going to say, like, you know, with Casey, like, I love your Pride Starbucks Workers United banner. One of the things that, you know, there was even a news story somewhere, I actually not remembering, but pointing out was like how significantly queer and often trans the leadership is of the Starbucks workers organizing movement. And obviously, like, think back to Bayard Rustin, LGBTQ people have always been in the labor movement, but I haven't seen so many people coming from queer organizing into union organizing, as we've been really seeing from the Starbucks workers work? Like, do you feel like there's a connection there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to say, kind of like looping in the last point with this point, is that this is a whole generation of people that often consider themselves activists outside of the workplace, whether that be for climate justice or gun violence or racial justice or all of these different things. And so many people are realizing that you can be an activist in your workplace as well. And that's actually a huge place where you can build power and change not just your job and not just build a democracy at work, but fundamentally change culture and society and laws and all of these things as well. But I think to your point about Starbucks, I mean, Starbucks is this company that brands themselves as a progressive company. And obviously we can talk all about how, no capitalist corporation is actually progressive, but, they do offer gender affirming care, which is a huge draw for people, especially in the service and restaurant and food service industry, where you just don't find that other places. And so there is absolutely, the vast majority of our organizers identify with the LGBTQ community. And I think even when we start meetings, we joke and we say, like, hey, she, theys, and gays, like, that's just like, like the population of people here. And we were actually, a bunch of us were in New York City this past weekend to do some organizing, and the number one stop was Stonewall, to kind of acknowledge like where this history has started with, and continuing on activism for the LGBTQ community with the labor movement as well. And so it's incredibly important. And of course, all of these issues are so intersectional. And unfortunately, Starbucks has used things like their gender affirming care as a union busting tactic to say, we're so great as a company, we offer you these things, and if you organize, you could potentially lose that. So not only do they do that, but they weaponize it, and people have really fought back against that. And I think it's been an incredible community to be a part of, and it's absolutely essential to our organizing. We changed our logo on Twitter. Actually, everybody, all like corporations and stuff changed their logos to the Pride version of their logos in June, and we waited till July and then we changed it because we were like, it's always Pride Month with Starbucks Workers United.
That's so real. And we can see really clearly in the media how one of the things that fascism is trying to use to radicalize in the right-wing sense to become more reactionary, the public, is anti-LGBTQ demagoguery, particularly in the form of transphobia. So I think you can really see how central the queer movement is to fighting anti-fascism, because they have chosen that as the vehicle for spreading fascism. And I think we have these conflicts sometimes, where that people try to imply that LGBTQ people aren't workers, like that this is some mythology of the bourgeoisie or something. And Starbucks workers have done such a great job showing that it isn't true. And Pride at Work, of course, has always been that's been your thing. It's been elevating the voices of LGBTQ folks in the labor movement. CM, do you think that there's a connection in anti-fascism and LGBTQ trade labor unionism in particular?
Yeah, I think it has many tenants or tentacles, if you will, tendrils that connect itself. I think Pride at Work has been around for so many years. I think it was like the late 60s, early 70s, that the constituency group was created, and across all of our unions, even some of the widest old white, stale, and pale unions, you may see members who are Pride at Work members, and they're advocating internally and showing up at their meetings. They're showing up and running for district office, and they're showing up and running for elected office higher in their unions. And Pride at Work continually is advocating for the inclusion of inclusive language in our contracts, and inclusive benefits, including trans health benefits and other LGBTQ specific benefits, but also being able to have a seat at the table is the other piece of it. And I'm grateful that the AFL-CIO has a constituency group for us. And I think the renewed focus on constituency groups as a whole has been a positive step forward, because there's lots of conversations happening about affected and impacted communities and other marginalized communities without us being at the table. And when we have constituency groups that do represent us, that are able to be at the table and speak for us, it changes the conversation. And I think if you are a member of an AFL-CIO affiliated union and you're not aware of a constituency group or how to get involved, reach out, because I didn't know anything. I was not involved and then got asked to get involved. And here I am, just was reelected the treasurer and fundraising director in August, and really think that we are on really stable footing to continue to make large scale impact across all of our federated affiliates. And there's 58 unions, and we don't have members in every union, but that's one of my goals by the time that I finish out my term, is to have at least one member from every union. And while our numbers may be small across the country, it's important to have our constituency groups and our communities at the table for decision making that affects us at the local and national level.
Thank you. And what do we say to people who claim that acknowledging the fact that people have a range of identities, queer, Asian American, et cetera, is somehow detracting from their ability to organize across lines? How do we respond to those accusations? Which it's kind of clear that I think that those are bad, but how do we respond to those?
I think it strengthens us as organizers when we're able to live truly and authentically with our identities on our sleeve. I think it encourages conversation. It encourages investigation. It encourages people to seek out ideas and ideals that may be different from those that they hold. And I think, Starbucks Workers United has done a great job of it. I think others are as well, of, being outwardly inclusive and living it authentically, their inclusion. And we're bringing all the other unions along board, whether they like it or not. And we're just going to keep living out authentically. And I think, for me, living proudly with my pronouns and as a queer person, being able to say in the workplace that I'm a queer and here's why my experience matters. As my dad was an auto worker and we grew up very poor, and my dad broke his back on the job, and the only reason we had a leg up is because he had a union contract, and that was my experience. And then I went off to college and knew nothing about unions, and then came to the Federation and was like, I'm going to make work better for people, for working people. And so I think living authentically and being able to have those identities outwardly present is important, and will just make our labor movement stronger.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to sort of reflect on unions as a force for anti-fascism and anti-racism, anti-homophobia in the workplace? That's cool. I think we have till 3:15, correct? I believe, yeah. Yeah, okay, good, thanks, because I have plenty more things we can be discussing. One of the themes of this conference is pro-democracy work and anti-fascism. In your work or organizing experiences, do you think that people are unionizing, and do we I'm so sorry, one second. Oh yeah. Are people organizing in response, in part because they feel like there's a tide of rising fascism? Are people cognizant of that in their decisions to unionize right now? I sort of see some nodding. Casey, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying about people being activists outside of the workplace, and then taking that inside. the workplace as well. And I've had countless conversations with coworkers who tend to be, like we're also Starbucks workers, so a lot of people tend to be more left-leaning in their politics anyway, who express frustration or, hopelessness in national politics or, what's going on around the world. And the response is always, well, I'm doing exactly the only thing that I can do, which is organize, that's the answer. Organizing and building power for, building power based off class and really focusing on that. And so I think, as we were talking about, like as the theme here, you don't have to share the same political ideology necessarily to be a part of a union and to fight for equal treatment and democracy and all of these things. So I'm not sure if that's, the number one reason when people are organizing, because there's so much fear involved in organizing and it's such a personal experience. So I don't want to say that that's like the main thing driving people's desire to organize. But I think that once you start to get into it, you realize that it is a tool and way to fight back against fascism and build democracy. So I think it definitely plays a part in people's minds.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think I'll just jump in with one thought. I mean, I think, there's always there's going to be a small segment of workplaces where you have leftists who can sit there and talk about fascism. But I think in every workplace that organizes, no matter where people work or what they do, people understand and respond naturally to their own lived experience of the personal experience of these things that we're talking about. Even if you can't discuss statistics about economic inequality, if you can pay your rent, how much childcare costs, how much grocery costs, the experience of being powerless at work, the experience of being stepped on by a boss. Everybody can relate to these things. And I think so, when we organize in all types of workplaces, whether it's a university or whether it's a factory or wherever it is, you always it's just about talking to people about their own lives. And what you find is that everybody kind of coalesce around these experiences that are part of these bigger trends that we're talking about. And, you don't have to use any jargon. You can just talk to people about their own lives. And a lot of times even you'll find people who might be Republicans and they might be Trump voters, but they're gonna coalesce around these same issues with you because they know through lived experience, what inequality means, even if they haven't translated that to national politics. And it's the same part of that transformation that unions can put people through in a positive way.
And sometimes it's one of the only spaces where they're going to see people who are of different demographics than them and have to view them as allies rather than a threat, basically.
Absolutely. You don't get a choice. It's like having a new family, it makes you deal with it. So it's healthy, even though it gets on all of our nerves sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, and I know that folks like Nicole have done an amazing job of navigating those conflicts and spaces. You guys are truly amazing panel. I could not have asked for better people to talk about these topics. Do we have another 5 minutes or are we wrapping now?
Can I add one quick thing and then you can
Please
tell me
go ahead. Yes.
But to add on to exactly what both of them said, they may not call it class consciousness, but like you said, it's a lived experience. And the memory of that the boss's values are different than yours and that their goals are different than yours, that is not something that's easy to wipe away. Even if you have a principal that was teaching in the classroom next to you last year, she is not your friend anymore. And people recognize that. And they also understand that there's a $20,000 pay difference. And I think that there's this understanding too, when you come from a resource colony, that, people come in, take your resources, leave you poisoned and poor. I mean, you are lucky to live to 70. Lucky. I'm 37 and I'm middle-aged. And it's I don't think that people understand unless that they've lived it, what it's like to have that understanding the entirety of your life, of like what it means, because you always have that idea of like the coal barons and the bosses and the coal companies whenever that you're from a place like this. Like those are always the bad guys. And whether that you're from West Virginia or Washington or wherever, you're going to have similar experiences in that the bosses are going to do whatever it takes to make a dollar, and that includes stealing your labor and putting you down. And so, yeah, I think there is that understanding as far as that relationship, and the fact that these handful of wealthy elites are running everything. They are the American oligarchy, whether that they call it that or not. There's always this kind of like, I can't bathe my kid in clean water. The water is orange from the mine drainage, but yet, you know, he can fly to wherever or whatever it is. Like there's this understanding of the difference, whether that they name it or not.
Thank you. Yeah. And I've seen personally how like the labor movement is the reason that people will blame capital and not the Jews for these situations, basically, which is one of the reasons why unions are so important in these fights. Well, I want to thank all of our participants for joining me. I know CM had to leave, and I know he'd want me to tell you guys to keep following at Campaign Workers Guild's social media accounts, as well as Pride at Work. Everyone can follow. Everyone is invited to do that. Casey Moore, where is the best way for folks to keep up with your organizing online and for them to support you in your organizing?
So all of our social media accounts are SB Workers United for the Starbucks campaign. And that's where we do, updates, store filings, things like that. We get to post about Howard Schultz and his latest union busting escapades, which, speaking of what Nicole was saying, this man had the audacity to come to Buffalo, New York, where I live, and talk about the crisis of capitalism. Richest 200 men in the entire world, and has the audacity to talk about the crisis of capitalism. Like, these people are so out of touch with reality that, organizing is the only answer here. And so, yeah, follow us on social media, go to your local Starbucks, tell workers good luck with their organizing efforts. This is the fight. Like,
oh no, we got disconnected. I think she gave us some great instructions in case she is not able to pop back in. Nicole, how can folks support your union online and follow you?
Sure. Our website, as far as the caucus, is wvunitedcaucus.org. You can follow us on Twitter, WV United Caucus. If you want to follow me personally, I'm Musical Mountain Mama on Twitter, and I post quite a bit. And you can find me by my name here and there and everywhere, whether it be TikTok or Facebook or Instagram or whatever. But thank you again for having us and for letting West Virginia have a voice.
Thank you. I'm excited to hear more from your music. Hamilton, I know where to find you online, but in case anybody doesn't, let them know.
I'm on Twitter at Hamilton Nolan. You can subscribe to In These Times magazine, great magazine with a lot of labor journalism. And please buy my book in early 2024.
Oh, wow. I have to wait that long? Okay.
Yeah,
I got it. It's okay. As for me, I'm on Twitter a little too much at ELANA_Brooklyn. That's ELANA_Brooklyn. I have digital strategy trainings I'm leading coming up like Friday even. So give me a shout out if you want to learn how to do digital in the labor movement and for allies and community groups. I think that's all the time we have. So I will now thank you all again for joining us. I know we're out of time for the day. Please go to Goddard, which is GODDARD.edu/the Alternative Media Conference with a dash in between, a hyphen in between each word. So it's the -alternative-media-conference to learn more about Goddard College and this event. We're planning to hold this conference every 2 years to coincide with the election cycle, because democracy is always on the ballot. And thank you for being a part of this.